I am Samantha, 33 years old, and my mother-in-law thought $3 million was enough to buy my newborn twins and erase me. She stood in my bedroom holding a cashier check and divorce papers, flanked by my cheating husband and his mistress smiling like she won. "Take the money and vanish," she told me, "because Sydney is more fit to raise the heirs." I picked up a pen and signed away my rights. That night I disappeared into the Chicago cold. By morning, she realized the empire she ruled was paralyzed, and the woman she tried to buy had frozen every account she owned. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever outsmarted a toxic family member who underestimated your worth. Growing up taught me survival requires logic, not tears. I carried that lesson into my career as a forensic accountant. I built a reputation dismantling complex financial webs, catching the attention of the wealthiest families in Chicago, including the one I married into. My emergency C-section was 5 days ago. My body felt split in two and hurriedly stitched back together. I was sitting on my mattress in our Gold Coast master suite, nursing my newborn twins Leo and Lily. Physical pain was a constant dull roar, broken only by the sharp sting of the surgical incision every time I moved. Bloodstains on my sheets were a harsh reminder of the physical trauma I survived to bring these children into the world. The house was supposed to be quiet. Bradley, my husband of 4 years, was downstairs handling hospital bills. I shifted Leo gently to my shoulder, patting his small back, when the heavy oak door to my bedroom swung open without a knock. Beatrice, my 60-year-old mother-in-law, marched right into the room. She wore a tailored suit costing more than most people make in a year, her heels clicking aggressively against the hardwood floor. She did not come alone. Bradley trailed silently behind her, looking down at his expensive loafers, avoiding my gaze. Right beside my husband stood Sydney. Sydney was 24, a junior assistant at Beatrice's real estate firm, with wide eyes and a designer handbag she could not afford on her salary. Sydney did not look at me. Her eyes went straight to the bassinets in the corner, shining with eager, possessive hunger. Beatrice did not ask how I was feeling or ask to hold her grandchildren. She simply walked over to the bed and dropped a crisp piece of paper onto my lap. I looked down. It was a cashier check made out to me for exactly $3 million. Before I could process the string of zeros, Beatrice dropped a thick legal binder right next to it. The heavy thud made little Lily flinch in her sleep. "I want you out of this house by midnight," Beatrice said. Her voice was cold, sharp, and devoid of melodrama. This situation was just a calculated business transaction to her. Inside that binder is a formal divorce petition and a full relinquishment of your parental rights. You will sign them immediately. You will take this check. You will pack a single bag, and you will vanish from Chicago forever. I looked at Bradley. The man I married, the man who held my hand in the operating room just 5 days ago, could barely meet my eyes. "Bradley, what exactly is this?" I asked, my voice steady, despite adrenaline flooding my veins. Bradley shifted his weight nervously, shoving hands deep into his pockets. "Just sign it, Sam," he muttered, sounding like a pathetic child rather than a grown 35-year-old man. "Sydney is going to move in here. She is younger, she listens to my mother, and she is a better fit to raise future heirs to the family empire. I will buy you a small apartment somewhere if you really need it. Just do not make my mother angry today. Take the deal and go." Sydney stepped closer to the bassinets, her manicured fingers hovering over the delicate lace edge. "She is going to be a wonderful mother to them," Beatrice added smoothly. "Sydney implicitly understands the grand legacy of this prominent family. You were always far too independent, Samantha. Too focused on numbers and tedious corporate ledgers. You never really belonged in our elite circle. $3 million is a generous severance package for a temporary womb. Take the money and leave the children to us." Most new mothers would have screamed. Most women would have thrown the check in her face, cried uncontrollably, or begged their husband to come to his senses. But I am not most women. I am a forensic accountant and a wealth manager. I spend my days analyzing risk, calculating financial leverage and dismantling fraudulent corporate structures. Emotions do not win wars. Strategy does. I looked at the cashier check again. I looked at the legal binder. Beatrice assumed she was dealing with a weak, exhausted woman broken by surgery and betrayal. She forgot who I was and what I did for a living. She forgot I spent the last 3 years restructuring the entirety of her family offshore shell companies and blind trusts to evade IRS scrutiny. I knew every account number, every hidden asset, and every dirty financial secret this family possessed. I shed none. I placed Leo back into his bassinet next to his sister. I reached over to the nightstand, picked up a pen, and pulled the heavy legal binder onto my lap. Without protest, I signed my name on the divorce petition. I flipped to the custody surrender form and signed that document too. Beatrice smiled, a triumphant smirk spreading across her aging face. She truly believed her vast wealth had successfully bought my precious children. She had absolutely no idea she had just handed me the exact weapon I needed to destroy her. Beatrice snatched the heavy legal binder from my lap the moment the ink dried. Her manicured fingers traced over my signature, verifying that I had indeed surrendered everything. She let out a sharp breath of satisfaction. "A deal is a deal," she declared, her voice devoid of human warmth. "You have 12 hours to gather your personal belongings. Do not try to take any jewelry or assets purchased with family money. Security guards are instructed to check your bags at the door." Sydney stepped away from the bassinets, her eyes shining with greedy triumph. She clung to Bradley's arm, already playing the new matriarch. Bradley looked up from his expensive loafers, his face pale and slick with sweat. He stepped toward the bed. "I am sorry," Sam Bradley muttered. "If I fought her, she would cut me out of the family trust fund. I cannot lose my inheritance over a marriage. Sydney plays by the rules. It is business. Take the $3 million and start over. Please do not make this hard." I stared at the man I had pledged my life to. He was not a husband. He was a spineless coward, terrified of losing his allowance. He was willing to sell his wife and hand his newborn twins over to an assistant just to keep his sports cars and country club memberships. I felt no urge to scream or beg. The sudden absence of emotion was freezing, absolute, and liberating. The vulnerable postpartum mother vanished instantly, replaced by the ruthless forensic accountant who survived the most brutal financial sectors in America. I looked down at the cashier check resting on my lap. $3 million. To anyone else it was massive, but to this family, pocket change. I studied the bank logo, the routing numbers, the authorized signature. My mind processed the data with clinical precision. Beatrice had acted impulsively, driven by her desperate need to control the family bloodline and install a compliant daughter-in-law. In her arrogant haste to buy me off, she had made a fatal error. Beatrice fundamentally misunderstood the nature of my work. She viewed accountants as mere calculators, boring employees who tallied receipts and filed tax returns. She forgot the reality of the past 3 years. When the Internal Revenue Service started sniffing around their real estate empire, Beatrice had been terrified of federal prison. She hired me to restructure their entire wealth portfolio. I spent 36 months navigating offshore shell companies, Cayman Island accounts, and complex blind trusts. I built the financial fortress that protected her billions. I mapped every hidden asset, wire transfer, and tax loophole this family exploited. I knew where every single penny was buried because I was the one who buried it. I held the key to the empire, and she had just handed me the weapon to detonate it. Sydney tugged at Bradley's sleeve, eager to claim her prize. "We should go downstairs," she chirped, shooting me a dismissive glance. "The babies need to rest, and we need to start planning the nursery remodel. I am thinking a soft pastel green to match the vibe of the estate." Bradley nodded weakly, letting his mistress pull him toward the door. Beatrice lingered for a fraction of a second, her cold gaze sweeping over me and the blood-stained sheets. "Remember, Samantha?" Beatrice warned, her tone sharp as a razor. 12 hours. If you are not gone by midnight, I will have police remove you for trespassing. Do not force me to make a scene in front of the neighbors. You have your money. Now honor your end of the transaction." The heavy oak door swung shut behind them, the lock clicking firmly into place. The sudden silence in the master bedroom was deafening, broken only by the soft, rhythmic breathing of Leo and Lily in their bassinets. I sat alone on the edge of the mattress, the physical pain of my cesarean section incision throbbing against my abdomen. But my mind was crystal clear. They thought they had won. They thought they had secured their legacy and bought my silence. They thought my signature on those legal documents meant I had surrendered my children and my dignity. They were incredibly foolish. A contract signed 5 days after major abdominal surgery under heavy painkillers is completely void in any family court in the United States. Signing those papers meant absolutely nothing legally. I had surrendered nothing. I had merely bought myself time. I carefully set the $3 million check on the nightstand. I needed to move fast. My body screamed in protest as I forced myself off the bed. Every step was agony, but adrenaline masked the worst of the pain. I walked over to the bassinets, looking down at my sleeping twins. Their tiny chests rose and fell in perfect unison. No amount of money, no real estate empire, and no arrogant matriarch would ever take them away from me. I leaned down and kissed their warm foreheads, making a silent promise that their father and grandmother would pay for this betrayal. I moved to my hidden safe at the bottom of the closet. I spun the dial, entering the combination with steady fingers. Inside lay my encrypted hard drives, containing the unredacted ledgers of the entire family estate. I grabbed the drives, securing them in my bag. Then I picked up my smartwatch. I had activated the recording feature the moment Beatrice barged into the room. I had captured every threat, every word of extortion, and every admission of bribery in crystal clear audio. I pulled out my phone and drafted a highly encrypted message. I sent it to the only person I could trust, the man who had been waiting for this exact moment to strike back at the family that had shunned him. The text was simple and direct. "The tripwire has been pulled. Initiate Protocol C. Now I just had to get my babies out of this house before midnight." My secure messaging app showed a read receipt almost instantly. Jackson was awake. He was always awake when it came to dismantling the woman who had tormented his wife for years. Jackson is a brilliant black former federal prosecutor who recently transitioned into high-stakes criminal defense. He married Rachel Bradley, a estranged sister, 6 years ago. The moment Rachel brought a black man home to the Gold Coast estate, Beatrice revealed the vile depths of her racism and class elitism. She cut Rachel out of the family, entirely erasing her from the legacy. Jackson had spent every day since waiting for the perfect opportunity to legally decimate Beatrice and her entire operation. I was handing him the detonator. I watched the progress bar on my laptop as the audio file from my smartwatch uploaded to a secure encrypted cloud server hosted in Switzerland. The file contained 22 minutes of pure, unadulterated extortion. Beatrice demanding I vanish. Beatrice offering $3 million in exchange for human beings. Bradley consenting to the bribery. Family court judges do not look kindly on wealthy matriarchs purchasing infants from postpartum mothers. More importantly, federal prosecutors absolutely despise it. I looked at the divorce petition and the custody relinquishment forms sitting on my dresser. I had signed them, yes. But any first-year law student could tell you that a signature obtained 5 days after a major abdominal surgery, while the patient is actively prescribed heavy narcotic painkillers, is the textbook definition of medical duress. The contract was legally radioactive. Beatrice was so blinded by her own arrogance that she failed to consult her own legal team before ambushing me. She wanted a swift, brutal victory. Instead, she handed me actionable evidence of coercion. I picked up the $3 million cashier check again. My eyes scanned past the amount and locked onto the routing and account numbers printed at the bottom. A cold smile spread across my face despite the throbbing pain in my abdomen. Beatrice had made a catastrophic tactical error. She did not use her personal checking account. She did not even use the corporate operating accounts. The routing sequence matched an account I had personally restructured 18 months ago. It was the Grandchildren Educational Trust. This was a federally protected trust fund, established specifically for the health, education, and welfare of the heirs. Beatrice had illegally accessed a protected trust to fund a bribery scheme. Under federal law, withdrawing funds from a protected educational trust to extort a mother into abandoning her parental rights is not just a family dispute. It constitutes wire fraud, misappropriation of fiduciary funds, and federal extortion. It is a straight line to a federal indictment with mandatory minimum sentencing. I plugged a secure flash drive into my laptop. I needed to ensure my financial tripwires were perfectly calibrated before I walked out the door. Over the last 3 years, I had mapped every single vein and artery of the family wealth. I knew about the offshore shell companies in the Cayman Islands. I knew about the inflated real estate appraisals used to secure fraudulent loans. I knew about the charitable foundation Beatrice used as a personal slush fund to buy designer clothes and fund Sydney luxury apartment. I copied the master ledgers, the raw, unedited tax returns, and the hidden transaction histories. I organized them into neat, undeniable digital folders. If Beatrice wanted a war over my children, I was going to give her a financial bloodbath. I closed the laptop and slipped it into a reinforced backpack alongside the encrypted hard drives. My phone vibrated softly on the mattress. It was a message from Jackson. He confirmed the extraction vehicle was 10 minutes away. He told me to pack only what the babies needed for 48 hours and leave everything else behind. He had already leased a highly secure anonymous high-rise apartment under a dummy corporation. Nobody in the family network knew it existed. I began to move around the bedroom with slow, deliberate steps. The physical toll of the C-section was immense. A sharp, burning sensation radiated from my incision, with every movement threatening to buckle my knees. I gritted my teeth, forcing the pain to the back of my mind. I grabbed a duffel bag and systematically packed diapers, formula bottles, and a few changes of clothes for Leo and Lily. I deliberately left my expensive jewelry, the designer bags Beatrice had gifted me, and the keys to the Porsche on the vanity. I wanted the narrative to be crystal clear when the police inevitably got involved. I took nothing of theirs. I only took what belonged to me. The house was unnervingly quiet, but I could hear the faint murmur of voices drifting up through the floorboards from the living room directly below my suite. Bradley and Sydney were down there. They were likely celebrating their perceived victory, drinking expensive champagne and planning how to decorate the nursery once I was gone. The sheer audacity of their behavior fueled my determination. They thought they had discarded a minor inconvenience. They failed to realize they had just alienated the only person keeping their fragile tax-evading empire out of the crosshairs of the United States Department of Justice. I walked over to the bassinets. Leo was sleeping soundly, his tiny fists curled up by his face. Lily was awake, staring up at the ceiling with quiet, observant eyes. I gently lifted Leo, swaddling him tightly in a warm blanket, and secured him into his portable car seat. I repeated the process with Lily, ignoring the sharp spike of pain in my lower abdomen as I bent over the bassinet. I did a final sweep of the room. The $3 million check was securely tucked inside the inner pocket of my jacket. It was no longer a payoff. It was Exhibit A. I checked my smartwatch to ensure the recording had fully synced to the cloud. The upload was complete. I erased the local file from the device to prevent any accidental discovery if there was a physical struggle during my exit. Every digital trace of my financial access had been wiped from the local home network. I left no footprints for Beatrice's corporate IT team to follow. I slung the heavy backpack over my shoulder, the weight of the hard drives pressing against my spine. I gripped the handles of the 2 infant car seats. The combined weight was grueling, but adrenaline provided the strength my healing muscles lacked. I approached the heavy oak door of the master bedroom. I pressed my ear against the wood, listening for any footsteps on the second-floor landing. Nothing but silence. Bradley was too busy playing the wealthy bachelor downstairs to bother checking on his newborn children or his recovering wife. That negligence was going to be his downfall. I turned the brass handle slowly, avoiding any sudden clicks that might echo down the grand staircase. The hallway was dark, illuminated only by the pale moonlight streaming through the skylight. I stepped out of the bedroom carrying my entire world in my hands, ready to trigger the absolute destruction of the family that tried to erase me. The grandfather clock at the end of the second-floor landing chimed a muted double strike, 2 in the morning. I adjusted my grip on the infant carriers, the hard plastic handles digging into my palms. Every step toward the service stairs felt like walking on broken glass. The fresh staples in my abdomen pulled and burned with the shifting weight of Leo and Lily. I forced my breathing to remain shallow and silent. The grand staircase was out of the question. It creaked near the bottom, a structural flaw Beatrice had refused to fix because the wood was imported antique oak. I bypassed it completely, heading for the narrow carpeted servant stairs that led directly to the mudroom and the rear service entrance. As I passed the balcony overlooking the main living room, the flickering blue light of a television caught my eye. I paused in the shadows looking down. Bradley was sprawled across the expensive Italian leather sofa. He was not asleep. His face was illuminated by the glow of his smartphone, his thumbs moving rapidly across the screen. He was likely texting Sydney, planning a future he believed he had just purchased for $3 million. He did not look up. He did not check the baby monitor. He was completely detached from the reality of fatherhood, entirely absorbed in his shallow desires. I felt a surge of cold validation. I was doing the right thing. Leaving him behind was not a tragedy, it was a financial and moral necessity. I continued my descent down the narrow service staircase. The walls felt tight, closing in around me as I navigated the steps sideways to accommodate the 2 bulky car seats. My muscles screamed in protest. A cold sweat broke out across my forehead, mingling with the sheer adrenaline flooding my system. I counted every step, focusing my mind entirely on the mechanics of movement to block out the searing pain of my surgical incision. 10 steps, 5 steps. I reached the bottom landing, stepping onto the cold slate tiles of the mudroom. I set the babies down for just a fraction of a second to catch my breath and retrieve the service door key from my coat pocket. I unlocked the heavy deadbolt with a slow, deliberate twist. The mechanism clicked open with a soft thud. I pushed the door outward, bracing myself. The brutal Chicago winter air hit me like a physical blow. The wind howled off Lake Michigan, carrying a biting chill that instantly penetrated my coat. I grabbed the car seats again and stepped out into the freezing night, pulling the door shut behind me until it locked. There was no going back now. The service alley behind the Gold Coast estate was dark, lined with high brick walls and security cameras. I had personally requested the corporate IT department disable for a routine system update hours earlier. A sleek black SUV was idling silently 20 yards down the alley. Its headlights were off, but the faint glow of the dashboard illuminated the silhouette of the driver. As I stepped off the concrete landing, the driver's side door opened. Jackson stepped out into the freezing wind. He was an imposing figure, standing over 6 feet tall, wearing a sharp wool overcoat over a tailored suit. Jackson moved with the precise, deliberate energy of a man who spent his life analyzing crime scenes and dismantling criminal enterprises. He was a former federal prosecutor, a brilliant legal mind who had recently transitioned into high-stakes criminal defense. He was also my brother-in-law, married to Bradley's estranged sister, Rachel. Jackson hurried toward me, his expensive leather shoes crunching softly against the patches of ice in the alley. He did not waste time with pleasantries or sympathetic hugs. He took one look at my pale face and the tight way I was holding my body, and he immediately reached for the car seats. "Let me take them," Samantha Jackson whispered, his deep voice barely audible over the howling wind. "Get in the car. It is freezing and you are bleeding through your bandages." I looked down, noticing for the first time that a fresh spot of crimson had seeped through my shirt. I relinquished my grip on the carriers, allowing Jackson to effortlessly lift Leo and Lily. He handled them with incredible care, moving swiftly back toward the idling SUV. I followed him, my legs shaking from the cold and the physical exertion. He secured the babies into the pre-installed bases in the back seat, checking the harnesses with practiced efficiency. Rachel and Jackson did not have children of their own yet, but he treated my twins with fierce, immediate protection. I climbed into the passenger seat, the warm air from the vehicle heating vents washing over my freezing face. Jackson shut the back doors and slid into the driver's seat, putting the SUV into gear. He kept the headlights off until we reached the end of the alley, turning onto the empty city street before accelerating away from the estate. "Are they secure?" I asked, my voice trembling slightly as the adrenaline began to crash. "They are safe," Jackson replied, his eyes scanning the rearview mirror to ensure we were not being followed. "You did exactly what you needed to do." "Did she sign the trap?" I patted the pocket of my coat. "I have the cashier check. $3 million drawn directly from the educational trust. I also have the smartwatch audio." She explicitly stated she was buying the children. A sharp, predatory smile touched the corners of Jackson's mouth. He had been waiting for this exact moment for 6 long years. When Rachel first brought Jackson home to meet the family, Beatrice had unleashed a torrent of vile racism and classism that fractured the family permanently. Beatrice could not stomach the idea of a black man, especially one who grew up outside of their elite social circles, marrying into her pristine real estate dynasty. She had cut Rachel and Jackson out of the family, entirely erasing them from the legacy and the trust funds. "She handed you the rope," Jackson said, his tone shifting from protective uncle to ruthless attorney. "Now we hang her with it." I spent years prosecuting financial crimes for the Department of Justice, Samantha. I have seen arrogant billionaires try to buy their way out of everything. But using a federally protected trust to extort a postpartum mother into surrendering parental rights, that is not just a civil dispute. That is a federal indictment wrapped in a bow. I opened my heavy backpack and pulled out my laptop, resting it on my lap. "I spent 3 years building her financial fortress," I said, staring at the blank screen. "She thought I was just a quiet accountant balancing her ledgers. She forgot that whoever builds the fortress knows exactly where to plant the explosives." Jackson steered the SUV onto Lakeshore Drive, the dark waters of Lake Michigan rushing by on our right. "Rachel sends her love," he added softly. "She is waiting for us at the safe house. When you sent the signal, we knew it was finally time." Beatrice thought she could discard people based on the color of their skin or the balance of their bank accounts. She is about to learn how the law actually works. "Drive faster," I said, opening my laptop. "I have a suspicious activity report to file with the federal government before the sun comes up." The glow of the screen illuminated the dark cabin of the moving vehicle, casting sharp shadows across the leather interior. I typed my decryption passwords with rapid, practiced keystrokes. The pain in my abdomen pulsed in time with the thumping tires hitting the expansion joints of Lakeshore Drive, but I ignored it. My focus narrowed entirely to the glowing federal portal loading on my display. "Do you have the leverage securely transferred?" Jackson asked. His eyes remained locked on the icy road ahead, but his voice carried the clinical precision of a seasoned interrogator preparing his case. "We cannot afford a single missing document when the sun rises. If Beatrice realizes she has been compromised before the trap fully snaps shut, she will mobilize her corporate attorneys to bury us in injunctions." "I have everything," I replied, verifying the secure connection to my Swiss server. "I have been feeding you the raw data files for 6 months. You know exactly what we are sitting on. Every single real estate transaction Beatrice artificially inflated to secure fraudulent loans is meticulously cataloged. I mapped the exact route she used to siphon millions from the family charitable foundation directly into her Cayman Island holding companies. The tax evasion alone is enough to trigger a mandatory federal prison sentence." Jackson nodded, the streetlights briefly highlighting the sharp angles of his face. "And Bradley," he asked, "the family court judge will need indisputable evidence of moral failing to justify your departure with the twins tonight. Beatrice will undoubtedly try to paint you as an unstable mother suffering from a psychotic break. We need to annihilate that narrative before her legal team steps into a courtroom." "Bradley signed his own death warrant months ago," I said, pulling up a specific subfolder on my desktop. I did not just discover Sydney tonight. I knew about her the moment Bradley used a supposedly blind corporate expense account to lease her luxury apartment in River North. I have the wire transfers, the digital signatures, and the falsified expense reports. I even have the receipts for the diamond necklace he bought her last week, categorized as a deductible corporate gift. He embezzled from his own mother to fund his infidelity, and Beatrice is too financially illiterate to have noticed. Perfect, Jackson murmured, gripping the steering wheel. We hit them with a synchronized strike. First, we secure your physical safety and legal standing. I have the paperwork drafted for an emergency restraining order. I will file it electronically with the night clerk the moment the courts open at dawn. I am citing medical duress, financial extortion, and domestic endangerment. Will that stop her from claiming I kidnapped the children? I asked, watching the upload progress bar on my suspicious activity report tick past 50%. Beatrice is ruthless. When she wakes up and finds the bassinets empty, her first call will not be to her lawyers. It will be to the police. She will try to put out a statewide Amber Alert just to humiliate me. The restraining order preempts any kidnapping claim, Jackson explained, his tone radiating absolute legal authority. By filing the emergency motion first, we establish a documented record that you fled a hostile environment to protect your newborn children. When the police arrive at the estate tomorrow morning, they will realize they have stepped into a volatile civil dispute, not a criminal abduction. They will tell Beatrice to take it up with a judge. By the time she schedules a hearing, the federal financial tripwires will have detonated. She will be too busy fighting off the Internal Revenue Service to fight you for custody. I hit the final confirmation button on the federal portal. The screen flashed green, indicating the report had been successfully submitted to the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network. The trap was officially armed. The moment Beatrice attempted to access the educational trust to clear the $3 million cashier check, the system would lock down completely. It is done, I said, closing the laptop and resting it on my knees. The report is filed. When banking hours begin, her primary liquidity will freeze. Jackson steered the heavy vehicle off the main highway, navigating through the quiet snow-covered streets of the South Loop. We approached a towering glass-fronted high-rise building that looked like a fortress of modern architecture. The streets were entirely empty, the city locked in the deep freeze of the early morning hours. Jackson pressed a button on his visor and a massive steel door rolled upward, revealing a brightly lit underground parking garage. He drove down the concrete ramp, pulling into a secluded spot near a set of heavy security doors. "Welcome to the safe house," Jackson said, shifting the vehicle into park. "You are completely untraceable here. I leased this penthouse 3 weeks ago under a dummy corporation I use for high-profile witness protection clients. The lease is buried under 3 layers of corporate shielding. The building management thinks a foreign tech executive is using the unit. There is no paper trail connecting this address to me, to Rachel, or to you." I exhaled a long, shaky breath, the reality of my escape finally settling into my exhausted bones. I opened the passenger door, the cold air of the garage biting at my skin. Jackson was already out, moving to the rear of the vehicle to extract Leo and Lily. The babies had slept through the entire ride, blissfully unaware of the financial and legal warfare erupting around them. We approached the security doors. Jackson scanned a digital fob and the heavy metal retracted silently. We stepped into a pristine, marble-lined private elevator lobby. Jackson pressed the button for the penthouse, and the car shot upward with stomach-dropping speed. My hands trembled slightly as I clutched my heavy backpack, the physical pain of my recent surgery flaring up again now that the adrenaline was beginning to fade. The elevator doors slid open, revealing a sprawling, ultra-modern apartment with floor-to-ceiling windows, showcasing the glittering skyline of Chicago. The space was immense, secure, and entirely impenetrable. Standing in the center of the living room, illuminated by the soft glow of a table lamp, was Rachel. She rushed forward the moment she saw us, her eyes wide with concern and fierce protection, ready to welcome us into the fortress her husband had built. Rachel wrapped her arms around me, mindful of my surgical incision, pulling me into a warm, genuine embrace that sharply contrasted the cold isolation I had endured at the Gold Coast estate. She immediately stepped back to take the heavy infant carriers from Jackson, murmuring soft, comforting words to the sleeping twins. This apartment was fully stocked with everything a new mother could possibly need, from advanced bottle warmers to medical-grade recovery supplies. We had planned this extraction for months, anticipating Beatrice would eventually cross a line, but seeing the meticulous preparation realized brought tears of relief to my eyes. The trap was set, the fortress was secured, and the countdown to dawn had officially begun. Rachel retreated down the hall with Leo and Lily, their soft coos fading behind the heavy soundproof door of the nursery. The penthouse was dead silent, insulated from the fierce Chicago winds battering the glass walls. I walked over to the massive quartz kitchen island, my boots leaving faint wet footprints on the pristine hardwood. Jackson followed, loosening his silk tie and placing a thick leather-bound legal pad on the counter. He poured me a glass of ice water and slid it across the smooth stone. "Show me the weapon," Jackson said, his voice dropping an octave, slipping effortlessly into the commanding tone he used when dismantling hostile witnesses on the stand. I reached into the inner pocket of my coat and extracted the cashier check. The paper was crisp, heavy, and completely unassuming to the untrained eye. I laid it flat on the counter under the bright glare of the overhead pendant lights. $3 million. A number that would alter the trajectory of a normal person's entire existence, casually weaponized to erase a mother from her children's lives. I booted up my laptop, the screen casting a harsh blue light over the financial instrument. Look closely at the routing sequence I instructed, tapping a manicured fingernail against the bottom left corner of the check. Beatrice is arrogant, but she is also astonishingly lazy when it comes to liquidity. She assumes money is simply money, interchangeable, and entirely hers to command. Jackson leaned over the island, his sharp eyes scanning the magnetic ink character recognition line. The routing number belongs to the Private Wealth Management Division of First Illinois Fidelity. But the account number prefix is isolated. It does not match the primary operating accounts for the real estate holding firm. Exactly, I said, my fingers flying across my encrypted keyboard. I opened my master ledger directory, navigating through the labyrinth of shell companies, holding entities, and offshore diversions I had spent 3 years categorizing. I typed the account number from the check into my database search bar. The system churned for a fraction of a second before retrieving the matching file. The result flashed on the screen in bold white text against a black background. Jackson inhaled sharply. "She didn't. She did." I replied, a cold, predatory satisfaction settling over me. Account ending in 4928. The Grandchildren Educational Trust, a federally shielded generation skipping trust established exclusively for the health, education, maintenance, and support of the heirs. Jackson stared at the screen, his prosecutor instincts immediately calculating the catastrophic legal implications of Beatrice's blunder. She did not use her personal liquidity. She did not tap the corporate discretionary funds. She literally raided her own grandchildren's federally protected trust fund to buy you off. She withdrew $3 million of their money to extort their mother into surrendering custody, I explained, laying out the financial forensics with surgical precision. Under the United States Tax Code, the HEMS standard dictates that trust funds can only be distributed for the beneficiary welfare. Beatrice is the trustee. She has a strict fiduciary duty. Instead of protecting their assets, she misappropriated them to fund a bribery scheme designed to sever their maternal bond and install her assistant as their new mother. Jackson began pacing the length of the kitchen, his mind racing through the federal statutes. Title 18, United States Code Section 1343. Wire fraud. By initiating an electronic transfer to generate a cashier check for an illicit purpose, she triggered federal jurisdiction. And because she coupled the financial transfer with a demand for you to abandon the children under threat of destroying your livelihood and trapping you in a hostile divorce, we have Title 18, Section 875, Federal Extortion. It gets better, I said, pulling up the audio file from my smartwatch. I played the segment where Beatrice explicitly stated the money was a generous severance package for a temporary womb demanding I leave the children to Sydney. She articulated the bribe. She tied the trust funds directly to the acquisition of human beings. In the eyes of the law, she is essentially engaging in child trafficking, using stolen fiduciary assets. "This is a spectacular federal felony," Jackson said, bracing his hands on the counter. If we present this in civil court, the judge will immediately refer it to the district attorney. But Beatrice has half the judges in Cook County in her pocket. She will try to suppress the evidence. We are not waiting for civil court, I replied, opening a secure virtual private network. We are going straight to the top. I navigated to the highly restricted gateway of the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network, known as FinCEN. This was not a standard banking interface. This was the direct line to the federal government, anti-money laundering, and financial intelligence agency. Working as a senior wealth manager gave me the highest level of clearance to flag catastrophic financial irregularities. I am filing a suspicious activity report. I told Jackson, my fingers hovering over the keyboard, but I am elevating this to a Tier 1 priority alert. I am attaching the audio transcript proving the extortion. I am attaching the digital footprint of the check issuance. I am fully documenting the breach of fiduciary duty and the misappropriation of the generation-skipping trust. I filled out the narrative section of the SAR with clinical undeniable facts. I detailed the exact flow of funds, the identities of the trustee and the beneficiaries, and the explicit criminal intent behind the transaction. I left absolutely no room for interpretation. I was handing the federal government a fully prosecuted case wrapped in a digital bow. When standard banking algorithms flag a sudden $3 million manual withdrawal from a protected trust, it usually just triggers an internal review, I explained, finalizing the submission packet. But a Tier 1 SAR ensures a human federal agent from the IRS Criminal Investigation Division reviews this file immediately. By linking the fraud directly to Beatrice, we trigger the Office of Foreign Assets Control. Jackson watched the screen intently. When the alert hits, what happens? The moment the federal agents verify the account discrepancy, they will initiate an absolute lockdown. I said, my voice steady and resolute. They will not just freeze the educational trust. They will follow the Social Security numbers and corporate tax identification numbers tied to Beatrice as the trustee. Every single account linked to her name, every corporate operating fund, every personal black card, every offshore gateway, they will all be hit with a blanket, federal freeze until the investigation is complete. I moved the cursor over the final submission button. The physical pain in my body faded entirely, replaced by the thrilling realization that I was about to dismantle an empire. I pressed the key. The encrypted packet vanished into the federal database. The screen confirmed the submission with a sterile generic reference number. The pin is pulled, I said, closing the laptop and looking up at Jackson. The trap is fully armed. When the banks open their networks at 8 o'clock this morning, Beatrice will not be able to buy a cup of coffee, let alone a judge. The sun rose over the Gold Coast, casting a pale, freezing light across the sprawling estate. Inside the master suite, the silence was finally broken. Bradley pushed the heavy oak door open, carrying 2 bottles of formula he had clumsily prepared in the kitchen. He was still wearing the expensive silk pajamas his mother had purchased for him. Sydney trailed closely behind, already dressed in a cashmere loungewear set, holding a stack of fabric swatches for the nursery remodel. They expected to find an empty bed and 2 quiet babies waiting for their new mother. Instead, they found a room stripped of its true value. The bassinets were empty, the blankets folded neatly aside, the $3 million cashier check was gone. The heavy legal binder containing the signed divorce and custody papers sat exactly where Beatrice had left it, the ink dry, the trap sprung. Bradley dropped the bottles. They hit the plush carpet with a dull thud, formula spilling across the floor. He stared at the empty space where his children should have been, his brain struggling to process the visual data. He spun around, frantically checking the walk-in closet, the ensuite bathroom, the adjoining sitting room. Nothing. Not a single diaper bag, not a single pacifier. Samantha was gone, and she had taken Leo and Lily with her. Sydney let out a high-pitched gasp, dropping the fabric swatches. She turned on her heel and bolted down the grand staircase, her panicked voice echoing through the silent mansion, calling for Beatrice. Beatrice was in her study, sipping a pristine cup of Earl Grey tea and reviewing the quarterly projections for the real estate holding firm. She looked up, her expression tightening into a mask of irritation as Sydney burst into the room. "They are gone," Sydney shrieked, her hands trembling. "Samantha took the babies. The room is completely empty." Beatrice did not spill a drop of her tea. She set the delicate china cup down on the saucer with a sharp, measured clink. She stood up, her posture rigid, radiating the absolute, terrifying authority she used to crush rival developers. She walked past Sydney without a word, ascending the staircase with deliberate, heavy steps. Bradley was still standing in the center of the master suite, staring at the empty bassinets. Beatrice assessed the scene in 3 seconds. The check was missing. The papers were signed. The children were absent. She took the money and ran. Bradley stammered, his voice cracking with sudden, unexpected panic. "She actually did it. She left." Beatrice let out a harsh, derisive laugh. "Of course she did. I told you she was a mercenary. She took her payout and fled like a coward. But she made a catastrophic miscalculation. She thinks she can take the heirs to my empire and vanish into the night. She thinks she can steal what belongs to this family." Beatrice pulled her solid gold smartphone from her pocket. She did not hesitate. She dialed 911. Her voice shifted instantly from aristocratic fury to the panicked, trembling tone of a distressed grandmother. "Yes, I need immediate assistance at the Gold Coast estate," she said, clutching the phone tightly. "My daughter-in-law has suffered a severe postpartum psychotic break. She has abducted my newborn grandchildren. They are in imminent danger. I need units dispatched immediately." The response was swift. The Chicago Police Department does not ignore frantic calls from the wealthiest zip code in the city. Within 12 minutes, 2 patrol cruisers pulled into the circular driveway, their lights flashing silently in the freezing morning air. 2 veteran officers, a sergeant and a patrolman, stepped out and approached the heavy oak doors. Beatrice was waiting in the grand foyer, flanked by a nervous Bradley and a wide-eyed Sydney. She immediately launched into her rehearsed narrative, demanding an Amber Alert, demanding a citywide manhunt, demanding the full weight of the police force be brought down upon the woman who dared defy her. "My daughter-in-law took the money and kidnapped the heirs to the family estate," Beatrice declared, pointing toward the stairs. "She is unstable. She is dangerous. You need to find her before she crosses state lines." The sergeant pulled out his notepad, his expression neutral. He was accustomed to dealing with wealthy, demanding residents, but he was also accustomed to verifying facts before launching a manhunt. "We need her full name, date of birth, and vehicle description, ma'am," the sergeant said calmly. "Do you have any idea where she might be headed?" Before Beatrice could answer, the patrolman radio crackled. He stepped away from the group, pressing his hand to his earpiece. The dispatcher voice came through, distorted but urgent. The patrolman listened intently, his eyes darting toward Beatrice. He keyed his radio, confirmed the information, and stepped back toward his superior officer. He leaned in, whispering rapidly into the sergeant's ear. The sergeant's posture changed instantly. He closed his notepad and tucked his pen into his breast pocket. The respectful, accommodating demeanor vanished, replaced by the hardened stance of a law enforcement officer who had just been fed a massive, deliberate lie. "Mrs. Vance," the sergeant said, his voice dropping an octave. "We will not be issuing an Amber Alert, and we will not be searching for your daughter-in-law." Beatrice stared at him, her aristocratic mask slipping for a fraction of a second, revealing the furious, entitled woman beneath. "Excuse me, I just told you she abducted my grandchildren. I demand you do your job." The sergeant did not flinch. He looked directly into Beatrice's eyes. "Our dispatch just received a notification from the Cook County Domestic Relations Division. An emergency protective order was filed electronically at 6 a.m. this morning by a licensed attorney representing Samantha Vance. The order explicitly covers her and the 2 minor children, Leo and Lily." Bradley took a step back, his face draining of all remaining color. "A protective order? Why?" The sergeant turned his gaze to Bradley. "The filing cites documented medical duress, financial extortion, and domestic endangerment. The presiding judge granted the emergency motion based on preliminary evidence submitted by her counsel. The court has officially recognized that Mrs. Vance fled a hostile environment to secure the safety of her children." Beatrice let out a sharp, incredulous scoff. "That is absurd. It is a fabrication." She is a hysterical woman trying to extort more money from this family. She signed the custody relinquishment. I have the paperwork right upstairs. Then I suggest you take that paperwork to a civil court judge, the sergeant replied, his tone devoid of any sympathy. Because right now the court order dictates that your daughter-in-law has temporary sole legal and physical custody. We have been instructed that any attempt by you, your son, or anyone affiliated with this estate to locate or contact her will be treated as a violation of a federal protective order. This is a civil matter, Mrs. Vance. We are leaving. The officers turned on their heels and walked out the heavy oak doors, the heavy click of the latch echoing through the silent foyer. Beatrice stood frozen, the reality of the situation slowly penetrating her arrogant armor. The police were not going to hunt Samantha down. They were actively protecting her. The narrative Beatrice had so carefully constructed was unraveling before it even began. She turned to Bradley, her eyes blazing with furious realization. She did not just run. Beatrice hissed, her voice trembling with suppressed rage. She planned this. She had a lawyer waiting. Bradley swallowed hard, finally realizing the magnitude of what they had triggered. Mom, what do we do now? Beatrice straightened her posture, the ruthless matriarch returning to the surface. We do what we always do when someone tries to steal from this family. We crush them. Call the wealth manager. I want every single dollar in her personal accounts frozen. I want her completely financially isolated by noon. I am going to bleed her dry until she comes crawling back, begging for that $3 million. Beatrice turned and marched back toward her study, completely unaware that the financial execution she was attempting to order had already been carried out against her. Sydney stepped out of the black town car and onto the pristine sidewalks of the magnificent Mile. The morning air was bitterly cold, but she barely felt it. She was buzzing with the electric thrill of sudden unearned victory. Back at the estate, Beatrice was pacing the study and barking orders at her legal team, furious about the police visit. But Sydney did not care about the temporary setback of a protective order. Samantha was gone. The primary obstacle had removed herself from the equation. Sydney was now the undisputed lady of the house, the future mother to the heirs, and the partner of a billionaire. To solidify her new status, she needed the uniform. She needed the armor of the ultra-wealthy. She walked through the heavy glass doors of the most exclusive European luxury boutique on the avenue. The warm, cedar-scented air of the store immediately enveloped her. A sales associate in an impeccable suit approached, recognizing the aura of someone ready to spend an obscene amount of money. Sydney bypassed the seasonal displays and walked directly toward the glass display case in the center of the room. She pointed a manicured finger at a rare matte black crocodile leather handbag. The price tag was $15,000. Yesterday, that number would have been her entire yearly rent. Today it was merely her introductory purchase as a corporate wife. I will take it, Sydney said, her voice dripping with rehearsed arrogance. And please wrap it beautifully. I am celebrating a major life transition today. The sales associate smiled politely, unlocking the case with white-gloved hands. He carried the bag to the polished marble register, carefully boxing it in layers of tissue paper and securing it with a signature silk ribbon. Sydney opened her designer wallet, an item Bradley had purchased for her just last week, and pulled out the heavy metal black American Express card. It was Bradley's primary account, directly linked to the family central wealth management vault. She dropped the heavy card onto the marble counter with a satisfying clank. The sales associate inserted the card into the reader. Sydney stood tall, adjusting her cashmere coat, waiting for the approving nod that always accompanied a purchase of this magnitude. Instead, the machine emitted a sharp, discordant beep. The sales associate frowned slightly, looking at the screen. I apologize, ma'am, the associate said, his tone maintaining a carefully constructed professional distance. The card has been declined. Sydney let out a short, dismissive laugh. That is impossible. It is a black card with no preset spending limit. The bank probably just flagged it for unusual activity because of the amount. Run it again. The associate complied, inserting the metal card a second time. The machine processed for 3 seconds before beeping again. The screen flashed the same relentless red text. It is declining again, ma'am. the associate said, his smile becoming slightly strained. Do you perhaps have another form of payment? A flush of heat crept up Sydney's neck. A few other wealthy patrons browsing nearby briefly turned their heads, drawn by the subtle tension at the register. The absolute worst crime in this zip code was being publicly exposed as poor. Sydney snatched the metal card from the counter and dug into her wallet. Fine. The fraud department is overly sensitive today. Use this one. She handed over a platinum corporate visa, an account Beatrice used for high-level vendor acquisitions. The associate swiped it. The machine beeped instantly. Declined. Try this one. Sydney snapped, her voice rising an octave as panic began to fracture her arrogant facade. She tossed a third card onto the marble. A joint checking debit card Bradley had given her for household expenses. The associate swiped it. Declined. The silence in the boutique suddenly felt suffocating. The associate pushed the 3 useless pieces of plastic across the counter toward her. I am very sorry, ma'am. None of these accounts are authorizing the transaction. We can hold the bag for you if you need to contact your financial institution. Sydney snatched her cards, her hands trembling violently. She spun on her heel and marched out of the boutique, the heavy glass doors swinging shut behind her, leaving her out in the freezing wind without her prize. She pulled out her phone, her fingers numb, and dialed Bradley's number. Miles away in the financial district, Bradley was standing inside a high-end artisanal coffee shop. He had left the estate shortly after the police departed, desperate to escape his mother's screaming rage. He needed caffeine and a moment of quiet to process the absolute disaster his morning had become. He stepped up to the counter and ordered a simple double espresso. His phone vibrated in his pocket. It was Sydney. He answered it, balancing the phone between his ear and his shoulder as he pulled out his wallet to pay the barista. Bradley, you need to call the wealth manager right now, Sydney demanded, her voice shrill and hysterical through the speaker. I am at the boutique on the avenue and every single card you gave me is declining. The black card, the corporate card, everything. It is completely humiliating. I am standing here looking like a beggar. Calm down, Sydney. Bradley sighed, massaging his temples. Mom probably just put a temporary hold on the secondary cards while she sorts out the legal mess with Samantha. I will call the bank and authorize it. Just give me a second. Bradley pulled a sleek titanium debit card from his wallet. This card was tied directly to his personal independent checking account, completely separate from the corporate holdings. He handed it to the barista to pay for his $6 espresso. He continued trying to soothe Sydney over the phone, assuring her that the family wealth was infinite and a declined transaction was nothing more than a clerical error. Sir, the barista said, looking up from the point-of-sale terminal, your card declined. Bradley stopped talking. He lowered the phone from his ear and stared at the young man behind the counter. What did you say? It declined, the barista repeated, turning the screen around so Bradley could see the glaring red error message. Insufficient funds or account frozen. Do you have cash? Bradley did not have cash. He had never needed to carry cash. He was the heir to a billion-dollar real estate empire. He grabbed his phone and opened his primary mobile banking application. The biometric scanner read his face and logged him into the dashboard. Bradley stopped breathing. The screen did not show his usual 7-figure checking balance. It showed a single terrifying block of bold red text overlapping every single account listed under his name. Federal freeze initiated. Contact Financial Crimes Enforcement Network immediately. He frantically swiped to his investment portfolio. Frozen. He checked his offshore liquid asset gateway. Frozen. He opened the corporate management portal. Frozen. In exactly 12 seconds, standing in the middle of a crowded coffee shop, the reality of his situation crashed down upon him like a concrete vault. The empire was completely locked. The heir to $1 billion possessed zero liquidity. He could not buy a luxury handbag. He could not hire a lawyer. He could not even buy a cup of coffee. Samantha had not just walked out the door. She had severed the financial oxygen to his entire world. 30 miles away from the coffee shop, where Bradley stood paralyzed by his frozen accounts, Beatrice stepped out of her chauffeured town car in front of the towering glass skyscraper that housed her private wealth management firm. The icy Chicago wind whipped at her designer coat, but she ignored it, driven entirely by a singular burning rage. Her phone had been ringing incessantly for the past 20 minutes. First, it was her corporate attorneys notifying her of the police dispatch alert. Then it was her personal banking concierge stuttering through an automated script about flagged transactions. Finally, Bradley had called weeping about declined espresso purchases and terrifying federal warning banners on his mobile application. Beatrice had hung up on her son in disgust. She was a woman who built a real estate empire by crushing weak men and outsmarting aggressive regulators. She firmly believed that money could solve any problem, and if money was currently inaccessible, it was simply a clerical error caused by an emotional, vindictive daughter-in-law. Beatrice marched through the revolving doors of the lobby, completely ignoring the security desk. She swiped her VIP access badge and stepped into the express elevator, hitting the button for the top floor. She was heading straight for Harrison Caldwell, the senior executive wealth manager who handled the family's most sensitive offshore holdings and generation-skipping trusts. Harrison was paid an exorbitant annual retainer strictly to ensure Beatrice never had to experience the inconvenience of financial friction. As the elevator shot upward, Beatrice rehearsed the exact tone of voice she would use to fire Harrison if he did not resolve this banking glitch within the hour. The elevator doors chimed and slid open. Beatrice bypassed the receptionist, striding down the plush, carpeted hallway of the executive suite. She pushed open the heavy mahogany door to Harrison's corner office without knocking. She expected to find him relaxing behind his desk, perhaps reviewing quarterly yields. Instead, she found a man on the verge of a cardiac event. Harrison was standing behind his desk, his tie loosened, his forehead shining with a thick layer of nervous sweat. He was staring at 3 large computer monitors, all of which were flashing identical, unyielding red alert screens. He looked up as Beatrice entered, and the sheer terror in his eyes made her pause for a fraction of a second. "Fix this immediately," Beatrice demanded, slamming her designer handbag onto his polished desk. "I do not care what firewall Samantha managed to trip on her way out the door. You will call the regional bank director, you will authorize a manual override, and you will restore liquidity to my son's accounts and my corporate operating funds before I decide to move my entire portfolio to a competitor." Harrison swallowed hard, his hands trembling as he gripped the edge of his desk. "Beatrice," he said, his voice cracking slightly, "I cannot do that. Nobody can do that. Not the regional director, not the bank president. You have been hit with a Tier 1 suspicious activity report by the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network. The federal government has locked the entire infrastructure." "Then call our federal lobbyists," Beatrice snapped, her patience evaporating. "We pay them millions for moments exactly like this. Tell them it is a domestic dispute that spiraled out of control. Tell them my unstable daughter-in-law hacked the system." Harrison slowly shook his head, looking at Beatrice with a mixture of pity and absolute horror. "You do not understand the mechanics of what has happened here. This is not a hack. Samantha did not breach the system from the outside. She locked it from the inside using the legal authority you gave her." "What are you talking about?" Beatrice hissed, leaning over the desk. "I am the matriarch of this family. I am the sole controller of the estate." "You were the controller," Harrison corrected, pulling a thick physical legal file from a stack on his desk. "Do you remember the massive IRS audit 2 years ago? The one that threatened to dismantle your entire real estate holding company because of the aggressive offshore tax strategies we were utilizing? The federal agents were demanding to pierce the corporate veil. You were facing potential criminal tax evasion charges." "Of course I remember," Beatrice snapped. "Samantha handled it. She restructured the shell companies and shielded the assets. She saved the firm." Harrison opened the file, sliding a densely typed, notarized document across the desk toward her. "To shield the assets from the IRS, Samantha advised you to legally distance yourself from direct control of the primary holding trusts. She told you that the only way to prevent the federal auditors from seizing the capital was to transfer the role of primary trustee to a clean, uncompromised fiduciary. You agreed. You signed the transfer documents in this very office. You legally made Samantha the primary trustee of the entire family wealth network." Beatrice stared at the document, her heart pounding a heavy, irregular rhythm against her ribs. That was a temporary measure, she argued, her voice losing its absolute certainty. It was a paper shield. She works for me. She is my subordinate. Harrison tapped the document with a shaking finger. She rewrote the trust bylaws when she assumed the role Beatrice. She drafted a master agreement that governs every single account, including the Grandchildren Educational Trust. I was reviewing the specific clauses this morning after the federal freeze hit. Samantha secretly baked a moral turpitude clause into the foundational charter of the trust. Beatrice felt a cold, paralyzing dread creeping up her spine. What exactly does that mean? It means she anticipated this exact scenario, Harrison explained, his voice dropping to a grim whisper. The clause is airtight. It explicitly states that if the primary beneficiary, which is Bradley, engages in any documented moral failing that threatens the stability of the estate, including documented adultery, the primary trustee has the unilateral, unquestionable power to freeze all assets to protect the ultimate heirs. The ultimate heirs are her newborn twins. Beatrice gripped the edge of the desk, the room suddenly spinning. You are telling me she froze my money legally? Harrison nodded, his face pale. She possesses absolute fiduciary authority. She triggered the federal freeze by reporting your attempt to withdraw $3 million from the Educational Trust as an act of extortion. But even if the federal government lifts their freeze, Samantha holds the structural lock. Because Bradley brought a mistress into the marital home, Samantha activated the moral turpitude clause. The banks are legally bound by the trust charter to honor her lockdown. You cannot touch a single dime of your own empire because, legally speaking, it is no longer your empire to control. Samantha holds the keys to the kingdom, and she has bolted the gates from the inside. By noon, the financial tremor generated by my suspicious activity report breached the heavily guarded walls of Beatrice Wealth Management firm and spilled directly onto the trading floors of Wall Street. Financial algorithms are designed to detect anomalies, and the sudden freezing of a multi-billion-dollar real estate portfolio is a glaring, unmistakable anomaly. Whispers of a sweeping federal lockdown hit the Bloomberg terminals first. Then the major financial news networks picked up the scent. I sat in the safe house living room sipping hot tea while watching the television screen. The ticker at the bottom of the news broadcast flashed in bright red letters announcing an unconfirmed federal probe into Beatrice Real Estate Holding Company. Analysts speculated wildly about the sudden lack of liquidity. Rumors of impending investigations by the Securities and Exchange Commission and the Internal Revenue Service spread like wildfire across social media and institutional trading forums. Shareholders began dumping their stock. The share price of Beatrice Primary Public Entity started to jitter, dropping 3% in the first hour, then 5%, then 8%. It was a corporate bleed, slow at first, then accelerating into a hemorrhage. Every single share sold eroded another fraction of Beatrice's precious legacy. She had spent decades cultivating an image of absolute financial invincibility. I shattered it before lunchtime with a single keystroke. While Beatrice was trapped watching her net worth plummet on live television, Bradley was experiencing the brutal reality of his frozen assets on the streets of Chicago. He had left the coffee shop in a state of blind panic. He was behind the wheel of his corporate-leased Porsche, a $200,000 machine that Beatrice Holding Company paid for as a deductible executive perk. He was stopped at a red light at the intersection of Michigan Avenue and Wacker Drive, surrounded by midday traffic. The corporate lease agreement on that vehicle contained a highly sensitive automated default trigger. When the federal freeze hit the holding company accounts, the leasing agency banking system instantly registered a critical default. They issued an immediate repossession order to a recovery crew operating downtown. As Bradley waited for the light to turn green, a heavy-duty tow truck with flashing amber lights aggressively blocked the intersection, boxing the Porsche in completely. Two massive men jumped out and approached his vehicle. Bradley rolled down his window, screaming at them to move their truck. Instead of complying, the lead recovery agent slapped a thick yellow repossession notice directly onto the windshield. The agent loudly informed Bradley that the corporate accounts funding the lease had been seized by federal authorities. He ordered Bradley to exit the car immediately or face arrest for grand theft. Horns blared from the blocked traffic. Pedestrians stopped on the sidewalks, pulling out their phones to record the spectacle of a wealthy man being humiliated in the center of the city. Bradley, realizing he had no money to bribe the men and no legal standing to keep the car, was forced to step out onto the freezing pavement. He had to stand there shivering in his silk pajamas and thin coat, watching the tow truck hoist his prized possession into the air and drive away. The heir to a real estate empire was left stranded on a street corner, completely broke and stripped of his dignity. Bradley begged a passing cab driver to take him back to the Gold Coast estate, promising the security guards would pay the fare upon arrival. When he stumbled through the heavy oak doors, freezing and deeply humiliated, he found Sydney pacing the grand foyer. She was surrounded by 3 large designer suitcases hastily packed and zipped shut. The illusion of her newfound billionaire lifestyle had evaporated the moment her shopping spree was denied. She had spent the last 2 hours watching the financial news networks, detailing the catastrophic implosion of the family holding company. She had read the social media posts showing Bradley standing helplessly next to his repossessed sports car. The glamorous fantasy she had bought into was rapidly transforming into a legal and financial nightmare. Bradley rushed toward her, desperate for comfort, reaching out to pull her into an embrace. Sydney stepped backward, her face twisted in a mixture of panic and revulsion. She held up her hands, physically blocking him from coming any closer. She demanded to know what was happening, screaming that her credit cards were useless, and the entire internet was predicting federal indictments for the family. Bradley tried to lie, stammering out weak promises that his mother was fixing a minor banking error and that the money would be accessible by tomorrow morning. Sydney was young and greedy, but she was not completely stupid. She saw the sheer terror in his eyes and the pathetic way he stood shivering in the foyer. "You have absolutely nothing," Sydney spat, her voice echoing off the marble floors. "You told me Samantha was gone and the empire was ours. But you are broke, Bradley. The federal government is going to seize this house and I am not going to prison because your mother is a tax-evading criminal." Bradley begged her to stay, his voice cracking as he promised to figure it out. He reminded her that she was supposed to be the new mother to his children. Sydney laughed, a harsh, mocking sound that completely destroyed his remaining pride. "I wanted the black card and the penthouse," she sneered, grabbing the handles of her suitcases. "I did not want to raise another woman crying babies while you fight off the Internal Revenue Service. You are useless without your mother money." Sydney turned her back on him and walked out the front door, hauling her luggage down the icy steps toward a waiting rideshare vehicle. She left him standing alone in the massive, echoing foyer of a house he no longer truly owned. In less than 12 hours, Bradley had lost his wife, his children, his fortune, his car, and the mistress he blew up his life to keep. He collapsed onto the bottom step of the grand staircase, burying his face in his hands, finally realizing the absolute magnitude of the destruction he had invited into his life. Beatrice found Bradley exactly where Sydney had left him. He was weeping on the bottom step of the grand staircase, his face buried in his trembling hands. Beatrice did not offer a comforting touch or a maternal embrace. She looked at her son with utter revulsion. He had allowed his mistress to flee at the first sign of financial friction, and he had permitted his assets to be seized in the middle of a public intersection. Beatrice stepped around him, her designer heels clicking sharply against the marble floor. She had an empire to reclaim, and she had no time to coddle a weak man. The federal freeze had locked her digital accounts and blocked her corporate credit lines, but Beatrice was a relic of the old Chicago real estate bloodlines. She never trusted digital infrastructure completely. She walked into the private library of the estate, bypassed the shelves of leather-bound books, and opened a hidden wall safe concealed behind a heavy oil painting. Inside lay stacks of pristine $100 bills and a collection of untraceable bearer bonds. It was her doomsday fund. She swept the entire contents into a heavy leather briefcase, It amounted to roughly $500,000 in untraceable liquid cash. It was enough to buy the most vicious legal mercenaries in the state of Illinois. She took a private car service to the downtown offices of Kensington and Roth. They were not just family law attorneys. They were apex predators who specialized in destroying lives, burying opposing spouses in insurmountable legal debt, and securing absolute custody for the highest bidder. Beatrice dropped the heavy leather briefcase directly onto the mahogany conference table. The senior partner opened it, verifying the cash retainer without batting an eye. Beatrice demanded an immediate, overwhelming legal assault. She instructed them to draft an emergency motion to strip Samantha of the primary trustee title and demand the immediate return of Leo and Lily. The narrative they constructed in that conference room was entirely fictitious, but legally terrifying. They framed the situation to make Samantha look like an unstable woman suffering from severe postpartum psychosis. They claimed she had violently kidnapped the heirs and illegally hijacked the family trust in a state of paranoid delusion. The motion petitioned the court to declare Samantha mentally unfit void, her fiduciary authority under the Moral Turpitude Clause, and grant Beatrice temporary emergency guardianship of the newborn twins. The lawyers filed the paperwork aggressively, bypassing standard procedures to demand an ex parte hearing within 24 hours. They intended to blindside Samantha. Beatrice assumed her daughter-in-law was hiding in a cheap motel, crying over her ruined marriage and crumbling under the weight of single motherhood. They expected a quick, brutal victory in a courtroom where Beatrice had spent decades buying influence through political campaign donations. Miles away in the highly secured safe house, Jackson received the electronic notification of the emergency hearing on his encrypted tablet. He was sitting at the court's kitchen island reviewing the digital traps we had laid the night before. He read the motion aloud, his voice steady, analytical, and completely devoid of intimidation. "They are claiming postpartum psychosis," Jackson noted, tapping the screen with a stylus. "They want the judge to rule that your asset freeze was not a calculated fiduciary action, but the erratic behavior of a medically compromised woman. They are asking for full custody and the immediate reinstatement of Beatrice as the primary trustee." I did not flinch. I poured myself a glass of water, my mind operating with cold, unyielding efficiency. "Let them claim whatever they want," I replied, taking a slow sip. "A medical claim requires medical proof, and we have the exact opposite. We are going to let them walk right into the trap." Jackson smiled, the brilliant former federal prosecutor recognizing a flawless defense strategy. We spent the remainder of the evening preparing our counteroffensive. We gathered the hospital records, clearing me of any psychological distress. We secured the smartwatch audio file proving the extortion. We compiled the bank routing data and the suspicious activity report confirmation. We assembled a legal package so dense with federal evidence that no family court judge would dare rule against it without risking a federal obstruction charge. I selected my outfit for the hearing with deliberate care. I bypassed the flashy designer labels Beatrice had always forced upon me during my marriage. Instead, I chose a sharp, understated charcoal suit tailored for absolute professionalism. I pulled my hair back into a severe, polished style. I needed to look exactly like what I was, a highly competent, razor-sharp financial executive who held the fate of a billion-dollar empire in her hands. The morning of the hearing arrived with a biting chill in the air. The county courthouse was a towering monolith of steel and glass in the heart of the Chicago Loop. I arrived in the back of Jackson's armored SUV, stepping out onto the freezing concrete plaza. The physical pain from my surgery had dulled to a manageable ache, entirely replaced by a surge of pure, focused adrenaline. Jackson walked beside me, his tall frame cutting an imposing figure in his tailored suit, carrying a single black briefcase containing the instruments of Beatrice's destruction. We moved with quiet, synchronized authority. We entered the grand marble lobby just as Beatrice made her entrance. The contrast between our two factions could not have been more striking. Beatrice strutted through the revolving doors, wearing a pristine white Chanel suit draped in pearls that probably cost more than a small suburban house. She was flanked by a bloated entourage of 6 junior associates, 2 senior partners, and a terrified-looking Bradley, who trailed behind her like an obedient dog. She exuded absolute suffocating arrogance. She walked as if she owned the building, expecting the crowds of lawyers and citizens to part ways for the matriarch of the Gold Coast. Beatrice spotted me standing near the security metal detectors, her lips curled into a victorious, condescending smirk. She looked at my understated suit and then at Jackson, entirely dismissing him with a subtle roll of her eyes. She still refused to acknowledge his legal brilliance, blinded by her inherent racism and deeply ingrained class elitism. She assumed Jackson was merely a driver or a cheap paralegal I had scraped together at the last minute. She believed I was walking into a slaughter, a helpless mother about to be crushed by her infinite wealth. She adjusted her Chanel jacket, leaning toward her lead attorney to whisper a joke at my expense. I did not break eye contact. I maintained a posture of absolute stillness. Let her wear the designer clothes and command her expensive mercenaries. She was walking blindly into a federal ambush. The courtroom doors were waiting on the 5th floor, and I was about to teach Beatrice a masterclass in forensic warfare. The heavy mahogany doors of courtroom 5B swung open, and we stepped into the arena. The courtroom was a stark contrast to the chaotic emotional battleground of the Gold Coast estate. Here the air was sterile, governed by procedure and cold hard facts. Judge Hernandez, a woman with a reputation for zero tolerance regarding courtroom theatrics, presided over the bench. She sorted through a stack of preliminary filings, her expression rigid and unreadable. Beatrice took her seat at the plaintiff table, flanked by her 3 senior attorneys and an incredibly pale Bradley. They spread out their thick leather-bound legal pads, radiating a manufactured aura of absolute dominance. Jackson and I took our seats at the defense table. We had a single manila folder between us. Beatrice shot one final contemptuous glare in Jackson's direction before turning her attention to the bench, fully expecting the judge to hand her the keys to my life. The bailiff called the court to order, and Judge Hernandez immediately signaled for Beatrice's lead attorney to present his emergency motion. A man in a bespoke pinstripe suit stood up, buttoning his jacket with practiced theatricality. He introduced himself as Mr. Pierce, senior partner of the most ruthless family law firm in Chicago. Pierce did not waste a single second before launching a vicious, calculated attack on my character. He painted a picture of a desperate, greedy woman who had manipulated her way into a billionaire family, only to suffer a severe psychological collapse following the birth of her twins. "Your Honor," Pierce began, his voice echoing off the wood-paneled walls. "We are here today to rectify a catastrophic breach of safety and fiduciary stability. The respondent, Samantha, experienced a documented mental breakdown just 5 days postpartum. In a state of paranoid delusion, she kidnapped the sole heirs to the family estate in the dead of night. Furthermore, in a malicious attempt to extort the family, she illegally hijacked the family corporate trust accounts, effectively freezing billions of dollars in real estate assets. We are asking the court to immediately strip her of her fraudulently obtained trustee title, freeze her personal assets, and grant my client Beatrice full emergency custody of the newborn children to ensure their immediate physical safety." Pierce spoke for 10 solid minutes, weaving a tapestry of lies designed to make me look like an erratic gold digger holding a real estate empire hostage. He spoke of my supposedly fragile mental state, citing the sudden disappearance as proof of my instability. He casually slid the signed divorce petition and the custody relinquishment forms across the desk to the court clerk, presenting them as evidence that I had willingly abandoned my rights before experiencing a psychotic break and fleeing. Beatrice sat back in her chair, a look of profound satisfaction settling over her features. She genuinely believed Pierce had just delivered the killing blow. Judge Hernandez reviewed the documents, her brow furrowing slightly, before she turned her gaze to our table. "Mr. Pierce has made some severe allegations regarding your client's mental fitness and the legality of the asset freeze," the judge stated, her voice cutting through the silent room. "Counsel, how do you respond to this emergency motion?" Jackson stood up. He did not button a bespoke jacket, and he did not rely on theatrical courtroom pacing. He stood perfectly still, exuding the absolute chilling authority of a man who had spent a decade locking away federal criminals. When he spoke, his voice was deep, resonant, and entirely devoid of panic. "Your Honor." Jackson began, his tone analytical and precise. "Opposing counsel has just presented a highly creative piece of fiction. Let us address the facts, beginning with the accusation of kidnapping. My client did not kidnap her own children. She executed a lawful documented extraction to escape a hostile environment. At 6 o'clock yesterday morning, I filed an emergency protective order on behalf of my client, which was granted by this very court. She fled a home where she was being actively subjected to financial extortion and medical coercion." Pierce scoffed loudly from his table. "Extortion. Your Honor, the respondent willingly signed a custody relinquishment form. She accepted a financial settlement. We have her signature on the documents right in front of you. There was no coercion, only buyer remorse." Jackson did not even look at Pierce. He picked up the single manila folder from our table, extracted a stack of officially stamped medical records, and handed them to the bailiff to pass to the judge. "Let us examine those signatures." Jackson continued, his voice slicing through the courtroom like a scalpel. "Opposing counsel claims my client willingly signed away her parental rights. What he failed to mention is the precise medical timeline surrounding that signature. The documents submitted by Beatrice were signed exactly 5 days after my client underwent a major emergency cesarean section." Jackson paused, allowing the gravity of the medical procedure to settle over the room before delivering the devastating legal blow. "According to the hospital records, currently in your hands, Your Honor, my client was discharged with a strict prescription for heavy narcotic painkillers, specifically high-dose oxycodone. The hospital logs confirm she was instructed to take this medication every 4 hours to manage the severe trauma of her abdominal surgery. She took a scheduled dose at exactly 1 in the afternoon. Beatrice cornered my client in her bedroom and demanded those signatures at exactly 2 in the afternoon." Beatrice's smug expression began to fracture. She leaned toward Pierce, whispering frantically, but Jackson did not give them a second to recover. "In the state of Illinois, and under every basic tenet of contract law in this country," Jackson stated, his voice ringing with absolute finality, "any legal document signed by a patient who is actively under the influence of prescribed Schedule II narcotics is automatically null and void. A signature obtained under heavy opioid medication following major surgery constitutes the textbook definition of medical duress. My client lacked the legal capacity to enter into any contract, let alone one relinquishing her newborn infants." Jackson turned slowly, finally locking eyes with Beatrice-led attorney. "For opposing counsel to attempt to enforce a contract signed by a highly medicated recovering surgical patient is not just legally fraudulent. Your Honor, it borders on predatory conduct. Beatrice did not secure a lawful agreement. She ambushed an incapacitated mother in her bed and attempted to purchase human beings with a check drawn from stolen trust funds." The silence in the courtroom was absolute. The narrative Pierce had spent half an hour building was entirely annihilated in less than 3 minutes. Judge Hernandez stared down at the medical records, her expression darkening as she compared the medication timestamps to the signatures on the custody forms. She dropped the fraudulent documents onto her desk with a sharp thud. Beatrice's high-priced lawyers suddenly stopped writing on their legal pads. They realized with horrifying clarity that their client had lied to them about the circumstances of the paperwork. They had just submitted legally void documents to a judge, and Jackson had trapped them perfectly. The opening salvos were over, and Beatrice was already bleeding out. Judge Hernandez did not immediately speak. She continued to stare at the medical logs, her finger tracing the timeline of my narcotic administration, before slowly lifting her gaze to the plaintiff table. Pierce attempted to salvage the catastrophe. He adjusted his collar. His face flushed with sudden panic, and stammered that his firm was completely unaware of the medical timeline. He requested to withdraw the custody relinquishment documents without prejudice, claiming a simple administrative misunderstanding. He wanted to retreat. Jackson was never going to let them retreat. If medical duress were the only violation presented today, Your Honor, we would simply ask for a dismissal and leave this courtroom, Jackson said, his voice dropping into a register that commanded absolute silence. But the plaintiff did not merely attempt to enforce a void contract. She attempted to fund a criminal enterprise using stolen fiduciary assets. Jackson reached into his black briefcase and pulled out a clear plastic evidence sleeve. Inside rested the pristine cashier check for $3 million. He walked past the plaintiff table, ignoring Beatrice entirely, and handed the sleeve to the bailiff. "I submit Defense Exhibit A," Jackson announced. "This is a cashier check issued directly to my client, physically handed to her by Beatrice in her recovery bed. The plaintiff claims my client is a gold digger who stole the family accounts. The forensic evidence proves that Beatrice was the one writing 7-figure checks to purchase human beings." Pierce stood up, slamming his hands on the table. "Objection. Your Honor, the defense is making baseless, inflammatory accusations of human trafficking. A financial settlement in a divorce proceeding is standard legal practice." Jackson did not raise his voice, but his words cut through the objection with lethal precision. A financial settlement requires lawful negotiations between two represented parties. This was an ambush funded by embezzled money. Your Honor, I direct your attention to the routing sequence at the bottom of that check. The funds were not drawn from Beatrice's personal accounts. They were not drawn from the corporate operating funds. The routing sequence belongs to the Grandchildren Educational Trust. The color completely drained from Pierce's face. He turned to look at Beatrice, his eyes wide with sudden, terrifying comprehension. As a seasoned family law attorney, Pierce knew exactly what that meant. Beatrice holds a strict fiduciary duty as the trustee of that generation. Skipping trust, Jackson continued, methodically tightening the noose. The legal mandate of that account dictates that funds can only be disbursed for the health, education, maintenance, and support of the heirs. Instead, Beatrice unlawfully withdrew $3 million of her grandchildren money to bribe their mother into abandoning them. That is misappropriation of fiduciary funds. And because she generated a cashier check across state banking lines to execute this bribe, it constitutes federal wire fraud. Beatrice shifted in her seat, her aristocratic posture finally breaking. She leaned toward Pierce, whispering frantically, but her lead attorney physically recoiled from her. He slid his chair a few inches away, his body language broadcasting absolute professional panic. "We are not finished," Jackson stated, returning to our table and picking up a small, encrypted digital drive. "We have established the fraudulent source of the funds. Now we will establish the criminal intent of the transaction. Your Honor, I request permission to submit an audio file recorded by my client's smartwatch during the encounter." "Objection!" Pierce shouted, his voice cracking with desperation. "Illinois is a two-party consent state regarding audio recordings. The plaintiff did not consent to being recorded. This violates the wiretap statute and must be suppressed." Jackson remained entirely unfazed. Illinois law includes a strict exception to the two-party consent rule if the recording is made to capture the active commission of a felony, specifically extortion or bribery. The audio file in my hand captures the plaintiff actively committing federal extortion under Title 18 of the United States Code. The recording is legally admissible under the crime-fraud exception. Judge Hernandez looked at Pierce, then at Beatrice, her expression hardening into a mask of pure judicial fury. "Objection overruled," the judge snapped. "Proceed with the audio, counselor." Jackson plugged the drive into the courtroom audio-visual system. He tapped the keyboard, and the heavy silence of the room was instantly shattered by the pristine metallic sound of Beatrice's voice broadcasting through the ceiling speakers. The courtroom heard the entire unedited truth. They heard Beatrice demand that I vanish by midnight. They heard Bradley pathetic, spineless whimpering as he urged me to just take the deal. Then the most damning sentence of all echoed off the wood-paneled walls. $3 million is a generous severance package for a temporary womb. Take the money and leave the children to us. The audio cut off, plunging the courtroom back into a suffocating silence. No one moved. The air in the room felt thick-heavy with the undeniable reality of a federal crime played aloud in a court of law. I sat perfectly still, keeping my face entirely devoid of emotion. I watched the destruction ripple across the opposing table. Beatrice's high-priced legal team imploded. The two junior associates stopped taking notes, staring at the table in muted horror. The senior partners exchanged terrified, rapid glances. They realized they had been played. Beatrice had hired them to crush a supposedly unstable daughter-in-law, failing to mention that she had committed federal extortion to obtain the very documents they just submitted to a judge. In the eyes of the law, Beatrice had just turned her own attorneys into unwitting accomplices in presenting the fruits of a felony to the court. Pierce stood up, his hands visibly shaking. He did not look at Beatrice. He looked directly at Judge Hernandez. "Your Honor." Pierce began, his voice devoid of its previous arrogance. "The plaintiff legal counsel requests a brief recess. We need to confer with our client regarding these highly unexpected evidentiary developments." "There will be no recess, Mr. Pierce," Judge Hernandez replied, her voice dropping into a dangerously low register. Her demeanor had shifted from neutral arbiter to an executioner. She glared down at Beatrice with absolute unfiltered disgust. "Your client brought an emergency motion before this court claiming the respondent was a kidnapper and a thief. I have just listened to your client refer to a mother as a temporary womb while attempting to purchase her infants with embezzled trust funds." Beatrice opened her mouth to speak, her arrogance finally overridden by sheer panic, but the judge slammed her gavel down with a deafening crack. "You will remain silent," Judge Hernandez commanded, pointing the wooden handle directly at Beatrice. "You do not speak in my courtroom unless spoken to. You attempted to use the authority of this court to validate an extortion scheme. You submitted legal documents that were signed under severe medical duress. You have wasted the court time, and you have actively endangered the welfare of two newborn children." The shift in power was absolute. Beatrice had walked into the courthouse expecting to command the room with her Chanel suit and her expensive mercenaries. Now she was completely isolated. Her lawyers were actively distancing themselves to avoid disbarment. Her son was staring at the floor in pathetic silence, and the judge was looking at her like a common criminal. The trap had closed perfectly, and the financial matriarch of the Gold Coast was bleeding out on the courtroom floor. But Jackson was not finished. He turned back to the judge, his posture straight and his expression unyielding. "Your Honor," Jackson said, "the defense has one final piece of evidentiary documentation to submit and a witness waiting in the corridor to authenticate it." Judge Hernandez nodded, her eyes still locked on Beatrice. "Proceed, counselor." Jackson signaled the bailiff, who opened the heavy double doors at the back of the courtroom. Sydney walked in. She looked nothing like the arrogant young woman who had strutted through the Magnificent Mile days earlier. Her designer clothes were wrinkled, her makeup was smudged, and she clutched her handbag like a physical shield. Jackson had served her with a federal subpoena 48 hours prior, compelling her presence under the threat of immediate arrest. She walked down the center aisle, her eyes darting nervously between the judge and Beatrice. Beatrice gripped the edge of her table. "What is this?" she hissed at Pierce. "Do something." But Pierce remained frozen, refusing to object. He was entirely focused on preserving his own legal license. Jackson called Sydney to the witness stand. The bailiff swore her in. Sydney sat down, her hands visibly shaking as she gripped the edges of the wooden enclosure. Jackson approached the podium carrying a thick binder filled with my forensic accounting ledgers. "Miss Sydney Jackson," began, his voice echoing in the silent room. "You currently reside in a luxury condominium in River North, correct?" Sydney swallowed hard and nodded. "Yes." "And you recently acquired several pieces of high-end diamond jewelry," Jackson continued, "specifically a necklace valued at $45,000. "Yes," Sydney whispered. Jackson pulled a document from the binder and handed it to the bailiff to display on the courtroom monitors. "Your Honor, these are the unredacted forensic ledgers I acquired from my client. They map a highly sophisticated money laundering operation." The funds used to purchase Miss Sydney luxury condo and diamond jewelry did not come from Bradley personal accounts. They were not corporate gifts. Jackson turned to face the gallery, letting his words carry their full devastating weight. The money was siphoned directly from the Vance Family Charitable Foundation, specifically from a fund designated for pediatric cancer research. Beatrice embezzled exactly $500,000 from sick children, routed it through an offshore shell company in the Caymans, and used it to buy real estate and diamonds for her son mistress. A collective gasp rippled through the courtroom. Even Pierce physically recoiled, sliding his chair further away from Beatrice. Embezzling from a pediatric cancer charity was a crime so morally bankrupt that it shocked even the cynical defense attorneys. Jackson stepped closer to the witness stand, boxing Sydney in completely. Miss Sydney, under federal law, knowingly receiving assets purchased with embezzled charitable funds, carries a maximum sentence of 10 years in a federal penitentiary. The IRS and the FBI are currently investigating these transactions. Are you prepared to go to federal prison to protect Beatrice? Self-preservation is a powerful instinct. Sydney looked at Jackson, then at the undeniable financial ledgers projected on the screens. She looked at Beatrice, who was glaring at her with a look of pure murderous intent. In that moment, Sydney realized she was entirely disposable. Beatrice would throw her to the wolves to save herself. Sydney cracked. She leaned into the microphone, tears streaming down her face, destroying her careful makeup. "I did not know it was charity money," Sydney sobbed, her voice echoing through the speakers. "She told me it was a corporate bonus. I swear I did not know. Beatrice planned the whole thing. She orchestrated everything." The courtroom erupted into a chaotic murmur. Judge Hernandez banged her gavel, demanding order. Jackson pressed his advantage. "Explain what you mean, Miss Sydney. What exactly did Beatrice orchestrate?" Sydney wiped her eyes, her facade completely shattered. "The affair," Sydney cried, pointing a shaking finger directly at Beatrice. "She forced Bradley to cheat. She came to me 6 months ago and offered me a promotion and the condo if I slept with him, and helped push Samantha out. She hated Samantha because Samantha controlled the trust and refused to let Beatrice spend the money however she wanted." Sydney took a shuddering breath, spilling every dirty secret she had hoarded. "Beatrice told Bradley that if he did not start an affair with me, she would cut him out of the will entirely. She called Samantha a stubborn calculator who was ruining the bloodline. Beatrice wanted a compliant incubator for her grandchildren. She paid me to play the part. Bradley did not even want to do it at first, but he was terrified of losing his allowance. He just did whatever his mother commanded." The silence that followed was absolute. Bradley sat at the plaintiff table, his face draining of all color. He stared at Sydney, his jaw hanging open. He had genuinely believed Sydney loved him. He had blown up his marriage, abandoned his newborn twins, and surrendered his dignity because he thought he was engaged in a passionate, rebellious romance. Hearing that his mistress was simply a paid employee hired by his mother broke the final fragile pieces of his ego. Bradley snapped. He stood up so violently that his heavy wooden chair crashed backward onto the marble floor. "You paid her!" Bradley screamed, his voice cracking with humiliated rage. He turned on Beatrice, his face turning a dark, dangerous shade of purple. "You bought me a mistress. You ruined my marriage. You made me abandon my children because you wanted to control the trust fund. You treated me like a pathetic puppet." Beatrice stood up, entirely abandoning her aristocratic composure. She pointed a manicured finger at her son, her face twisted in absolute disgust. "You are a pathetic puppet!" Beatrice shrieked, her voice echoing off the walls. "You are a weak, useless disappointment. I had to orchestrate your life because you are too stupid to manage it yourself. I built this empire. You have never earned a single dollar. You let a middle-class accountant steal my grandchildren and freeze my money. You are nothing without me." "I hate you," Bradley roared, slamming his fists onto the mahogany table. "I lost everything because of you. You are a monster." The pristine facade of the Gold Coast billionaire family dissolved into a screaming, trashy brawl right in the middle of open court. Beatrice lunged across the table, swatting at Bradley's face with her designer handbag. Bradley shoved her arm away, screaming profanities that made the court reporter flinch. "Order in my court," Judge Hernandez bellowed, slamming her gavel repeatedly. "Bailiffs, restrain them immediately." 4 armed bailiffs rushed the plaintiff table, physically separating the screaming mother and son. They shoved Bradley back against the railing and forced Beatrice into her chair. Beatrice struggled against the officers, her Chanel suit rumpled, her pearl necklace snapping and scattering white beads across the courtroom floor. Her high-priced attorneys were rapidly packing their briefcases, practically sprinting toward the exit to avoid being associated with the meltdown. Sydney sat in the witness stand, sobbing uncontrollably into her hands. I sat perfectly still at the defense table. Jackson stood beside me, his hands resting calmly on his briefcase. We did not say a word. We did not need to. We simply watched as the mighty, untouchable real estate dynasty tore itself apart from the inside out, drowning in a sea of their own greed and arrogance. The echoing crack of Judge Hernandez's gavel finally overpowered the screaming match at the plaintiff table. The bailiffs forced Beatrice into her chair, her chest heaving as she glared at her son with absolute venom. Bradley slumped against the heavy wooden table, his face buried in his hands, his shoulders shaking with humiliated sobs. The entire room held its collective breath as the judge adjusted her glasses and stared down at the ruined, pathetic remnants of the Gold Coast real estate dynasty. Let the record show that the plaintiff counsel has failed to control their client. Judge Hernandez announced, her voice a sharp blade cutting through the residual chaos. I have presided over family court for 22 years. I have seen bitter divorces, corporate disputes, and terrible parents. But the level of absolute depravity, financial fraud, and moral bankruptcy displayed in my courtroom today is entirely unprecedented. The judge picked up the heavy legal binder containing the divorce petition and the custody relinquishment forms. She held them up for the entire gallery to see. These documents were obtained through a coordinated federally illegal extortion scheme. She stated, her tone radiating absolute judicial disgust. They were forced upon a mother recovering from major surgery under the influence of heavy narcotic painkillers. They are not merely void, they are a monument to the plaintiff's arrogance and criminal intent. With a swift, deliberate motion, Judge Hernandez ripped the thick stack of papers directly down the middle. The sound of tearing paper echoed sharply in the silent, marble-lined room. She dropped the shredded halves into the trash can beside her bench. I watched the physical destruction of the contract that was meant to erase me. I felt no urge to smile. I simply analyzed the victory with the same cold calculation I applied to my spreadsheets. Let us address the matter of custody. The judge continued, shifting her gaze to Bradley. Mr. Vance, you stood by while your mother attempted to purchase your newborn children. You engaged in a paid affair funded by stolen charitable assets. You have demonstrated a complete and catastrophic lack of parental fitness. You abandoned your role as a father the moment it threatened your financial allowance. Bradley did not look up. He kept his face hidden, completely shattered by the public dismantling of his ego. I am granting Samantha sole legal and physical custody of the minor children Leo and Lily, Judge Hernandez declared. Mr. Vance, your access to these children will be severely restricted. You are granted supervised visitation only, limited to 2 hours per week at an approved state facility. You will personally bear the cost of the court-appointed monitor. You hold absolutely no decision-making authority regarding their health, education, or welfare. I let out a slow, steady breath. Beside me, Jackson gave a single firm nod. The primary objective was secured. My children were permanently safe from the toxic grip of the empire. But the judge was not finished. She turned her attention back to Beatrice, who was sitting rigidly in her chair, her hands gripping the armrests until her knuckles turned white. Now we address your emergency motion to strip the respondent of her fiduciary authority, the judge said, pulling the trust bylaws toward her. You petitioned this court to declare your daughter-in-law mentally unstable and remove her as primary trustee. You claimed she hijacked your accounts in a fit of postpartum delusion. Beatrice raised her chin, desperately clinging to the last shred of her superiority. She had no right to freeze my money, Beatrice hissed, ignoring the frantic warning glare from her remaining legal counsel. It is my company. It is not your company, Judge Hernandez corrected, her voice echoing with unyielding finality. 2 years ago, you legally transferred the absolute authority of the family trust to Samantha to avoid federal scrutiny. You signed a binding charter that included a moral turpitude clause. We have just heard sworn testimony corroborated by forensic ledgers that your son engaged in adultery and that you facilitated this adultery using embezzled funds. The judge leaned forward, clasping her hands together. The respondent did not suffer a mental breakdown. She executed her fiduciary duty with flawless precision. Freezing the assets was the exact legal remedy required to protect the ultimate heirs from your reckless criminal squandering of their legacy. Samantha acted lawfully, rationally, and with absolute authority. I am denying your emergency motion with prejudice. Samantha remains the primary trustee, and the asset freeze is upheld indefinitely. Beatrice let out a strangled, furious gasp. She tried to stand up again, but the bailiff immediately stepped behind her chair, placing a heavy hand on her shoulder. She sank back down, trembling with a mixture of disbelief and absolute rage. She had come to court to crush me, and instead the judge had just handed me the permanent keys to her financial prison. And finally, Judge Hernandez said, her expression hardening into something truly terrifying for anyone sitting at the plaintiff table. There is the matter of the Defense Exhibit B, the forensic accounting ledgers. The judge picked up the thick binder of financial records I had meticulously compiled over the last 3 years. She looked at the pages detailing the money laundering the offshore shell companies and the $500,000 siphoned directly from a pediatric cancer charity to purchase Sydney luxury condominium and diamond jewelry. As an officer of the court, I have a mandatory legal obligation to report evidence of federal crimes discovered during civil proceedings, Judge Hernandez announced. The documents submitted today do not merely indicate a family dispute. They provide a comprehensive, undeniable roadmap of tax evasion, wire fraud, extortion, and the embezzlement of charitable funds. The judge picked up her pen and signed a formal, heavily stamped judicial order. I am officially referring this entire case file, including the audio recordings, witness testimony, and financial ledgers, to the Criminal Investigation Division of the Internal Revenue Service. Furthermore, due to the involvement of your publicly traded real estate entities, I am simultaneously referring these records to the Enforcement Division of the Securities and Exchange Commission. The words hung in the air, acting as the final fatal strike. A referral from a presiding judge accompanied by a complete forensic roadmap is not just an investigation, it is a guaranteed federal indictment. The SEC would halt trading on her company's stock immediately. The IRS would seize her remaining physical assets before the end of the business day. This court is adjourned, Judge Hernandez declared, slamming her gavel down one final time. The judge stood and exited the bench, leaving behind a courtroom thick with the stench of a slaughtered dynasty. Beatrice sat perfectly still, her eyes wide, staring at the empty wooden chair where the judge had just delivered her death sentence. Her high-priced attorneys were already walking out the door, abandoning her without a second glance. The empire was officially dead, executed by the judicial hammer, and I had orchestrated every single swing. The immediate aftermath of the ruling was a masterclass in controlled chaos. The bailiffs practically had to drag Beatrice out of the courtroom. She was fighting them every step of the way. Her Chanel suit ruined, her pearls crushed beneath the polished shoes of the court officers. Bradley was already gone. He had bolted the moment the judge denied him custody, too cowardly to face the wreckage he had caused. Jackson and I took our time gathering our files. We did not need to rush. We had secured the children, the assets, and the judicial referral. The victory was absolute. We stepped out of the heavy mahogany doors and into the wide, marble-lined corridor of the courthouse. The hallway was crowded with lawyers, clerks, and families waiting for their own hearings. At the far end of the corridor, near the bank of elevators, stood Beatrice. The bailiffs had released her, and she was pacing furiously, her face a mask of unrestrained rage. Her high-priced attorneys were nowhere to be seen. They had abandoned her the moment the judge mentioned the IRS. Beatrice spotted me walking toward the elevators. She did not retreat. She did not attempt to salvage her dignity. She charged. She closed the distance between us in seconds, her eyes wild, her hands clenched into fists. Jackson immediately stepped forward, positioning his imposing frame between me and my former mother-in-law, ready to physically intercept her if she tried to strike me. But I placed a hand on his arm, gently pulling him back. I wanted to hear this. I wanted to hear the final, desperate gasps of the empire I had just dismantled. Beatrice stopped inches from my face. She was breathing heavily, her chest heaving, the stench of expensive perfume and raw panic radiating off her. "You think you have won?" Beatrice hissed, her voice vibrating with a terrifying, venomous intensity. "You think a single judge in a family court can take my legacy away from me? You think you can use my grandchildren as leverage to steal what I built?" I did not flinch. I did not step back. I looked directly into her eyes, maintaining the cold, analytical composure that had infuriated her since the day we met. "I did not steal anything, Beatrice," I replied, my voice perfectly level. "I simply locked the vault. You are the one who tried to buy human beings with embezzled trust funds." The judge merely confirmed what the federal government already knows. Beatrice let out a harsh, jagged laugh. "The federal government. You think I am afraid of an audit? I have survived federal scrutiny before. I have lawyers who specialize in burying the SEC in paperwork for decades. You have temporarily frozen my liquidity, Samantha. That is all you have done. An inconvenience." "It is a complete structural lockdown," I corrected her. "The primary trustee has sole fiduciary authority. You cannot liquidate a single asset. You cannot transfer a single dollar offshore. You cannot sell a single property. You are trapped inside the fortress I built for you." Beatrice leaned closer, her eyes blazing with absolute, unadulterated hatred. "Then I will burn it down." She spat, her voice echoing down the marble corridor. "I will burn the entire Gold Coast empire to ash before I let a middle-class calculator control a single dime of it." I remained silent, allowing her to incriminate herself further in front of the dozens of witnesses currently staring at us in the hallway. "Do you hear me?" Beatrice screamed, entirely losing her grip on reality. "I will declare bankruptcy tomorrow morning. I will default on every commercial loan we hold. I will liquidate the prime real estate at a massive, catastrophic loss. I will shatter the holding company into a million worthless pieces. By the time the IRS finishes their investigation, there will be nothing left for them to seize, and there will certainly be nothing left for those twins. I will ensure they inherit nothing but dust. You want to play financial warfare with me, Samantha? I will scorch the earth so thoroughly that your children will be paying off my debt for the rest of their miserable lives." Beatrice stood there, chest heaving, waiting for my reaction. She expected me to panic. She expected me to beg her to reconsider, to plead for the financial security of my children. She thought the threat of total financial annihilation would break my resolve. She fundamentally misunderstood the game we were playing. I did not panic. I did not beg. I simply smiled. It was not a warm smile. It was the sharp, predatory smile of an apex predator who had just watched its prey walk blindly into a perfectly constructed trap. I let the silence stretch for a long moment, allowing the absolute certainty of my victory to settle over her. "Burn it down," I whispered, my voice carrying the lethal precision of a forensic ledger. "Please, Beatrice. Burn it all to the ground." Beatrice frowned, confusion momentarily overriding her rage. "What are you talking about?" I stepped slightly closer, dropping my voice so only she and Jackson could hear the final, devastating truth. "You forgot who filed your tax returns for the last 3 years, Beatrice. You forgot who analyzed your risk exposure. Months ago, the moment Bradley leased that apartment for Sydney using corporate funds, I knew you would eventually try to ruin me. I knew your arrogance would ultimately lead you to self-destruct." Beatrice stared at me, her breathing shallow, a cold dread beginning to seep into her features. So I prepared for it. I continued delivering the final blow. I used my personal capital, the money I earned, restructuring your messy illegal shell companies to buy credit default swaps. I bought insurance against your holding company debt defaulting. I legally shorted your empire on Wall Street. Beatrice's mouth opened, but no sound came out. She was a real estate mogul. She understood exactly what a credit default swap meant. She understood the catastrophic implications of what I had just revealed. If you maintain the company, the federal government will slowly dismantle it and seize the assets to pay your massive tax penalties. I explained, my tone entirely clinical. But if you bankrupt your own company out of spite, if you intentionally default on those commercial loans to ensure my children inherit nothing, the credit default swaps trigger immediately. I stand to make tens of millions of dollars in Wall Street payouts, completely independent of your estate, completely untethered from the IRS investigation, and entirely tax-free. The color completely drained from Beatrice's face. She staggered back a half step, her hands trembling violently. "So, go ahead, Beatrice," I said, my smile widening into something truly terrifying. "Declare bankruptcy, liquidate the assets, burn the empire to ash. Every match you strike just makes me richer. You have been entirely outplayed by the middle-class calculator." Beatrice collapsed against the marble wall, her legs finally giving out. She slid down to the cold floor, her ruined Chanel suit bunching up around her knees. She stared up at me with wide, hollow eyes. She finally realized the absolute truth. She had not just lost her grandchildren. She had not just lost her son. She had handed the weapon of her own destruction directly to the woman she despised, and I had pulled the trigger with flawless execution. Jackson placed a hand on my shoulder, guiding me toward the elevators. We left the matriarch of the Gold Coast, sitting on the floor of the courthouse, completely broken, surrounded by the invisible ashes of her ruined legacy. Beatrice stood in the center of the courthouse corridor with her chest heaving as her threat hung in the sterile air. She had just promised to declare bankruptcy to liquidate the prime Chicago real estate at a catastrophic loss, and to ensure my twins inherited absolutely nothing but a mountain of corporate debt. She expected me to break. She expected a mother to fall to her knees and beg for the financial future of her children. She stared at me with wide and manic eyes, waiting for the terror to set in. Jackson shifted his weight beside me. His protective instincts flared as a seasoned black former federal prosecutor who had seen desperate criminals lash out when cornered. But I held up a single hand to stop him. I did not need physical protection from a woman who had just handed me the keys to my ultimate victory. I took a slow and deliberate step forward, closing the distance between us until I was standing inches away from my former mother-in-law. The scent of her expensive perfume was sour with nervous sweat. I did not raise my voice. I did not need to shout. I leaned in, bringing my face perfectly level with hers, and let a cold and razor-sharp smile form on my lips. "Burn it down," I whispered, my voice carrying the absolute and chilling certainty of a forensic accountant who had already run the numbers. "Please, Beatrice, burn it all to the ground." Beatrice blinked, and her arrogant sneer faltered for a fraction of a second. The confusion was evident in the sudden tightness around her eyes. She had anticipated fear, not encouragement. "What are you talking about?" she hissed, her voice trembling slightly under the weight of my composure. "You forgot who filed your tax returns for the last 3 years," I replied, keeping my voice low so that only she and Jackson could hear the devastating truth. "You forgot who analyzed your corporate risk exposure, who structured your commercial loans, and who saw every single vulnerability in your over-leveraged real estate empire. Months ago, knowing you would eventually try to ruin me, I used my personal capital to buy credit default swaps. It is an insurance against your company debt defaulting." Beatrice swallowed hard, and her throat clicked audibly in the quiet hallway. She was a real estate mogul who had spent decades navigating the ruthless Chicago markets. She knew exactly what a credit default swap was. She knew that it was essentially a financial derivative that allowed an investor to bet against a company's ability to pay its debts. She understood the catastrophic implications of what I had just revealed, but her brain was actively rejecting the reality. "I legally shorted your empire on Wall Street," I explained, making sure she comprehended the absolute magnitude of her defeat. "If you maintain the company, the federal government will systematically dismantle it, seize your assets, and send you to federal prison for tax evasion. But if you bankrupt your own company out of spite, if you intentionally default on those massive commercial loans to ensure my children inherit nothing, my insurance contracts trigger immediately." I took another half step forward, backing her directly into the cold marble wall of the courthouse corridor. If you strike that match, I stand to make tens of millions of dollars in Wall Street payouts. I stated my tone entirely clinical and devoid of mercy. That money will be completely independent of your estate. It will be completely untethered from the IRS criminal investigation. It will be entirely tax-free, and it will go directly into a protected trust for Leo and Lily. Every single match you strike to burn down your legacy just makes me infinitely richer. The color completely drained from Beatrice's face. Her perfectly powdered skin turned a sickly and translucent shade of gray. The manic energy that had fueled her courtroom outburst evaporated entirely, replaced by a profound and paralyzing dread. She looked at me not as a subordinate, not as a middle-class nuisance, but as an apex predator who had just executed a flawless financial slaughter. "You are lying!" Beatrice choked out, her voice barely a breath. "You do not have that kind of capital. You do not have the institutional clearance to short my corporate debt. I am a senior wealth manager, Beatrice." I reminded her, my smile never wavering. "I manage assets for clients who could buy and sell your Gold Coast properties before breakfast. I have the clearance, I had the capital, and the contracts are already signed and sealed and sitting in a highly secured vault. You have been entirely outplayed." Beatrice stared at me with her chest rising and falling in rapid and shallow gasps. Her mind spun wildly as she desperately searched for a loophole or a legal maneuver or a way out of the trap. She tried to calculate a strategy where she could win, but there was no escape. I had engineered a perfect checkmate. If she fought to save her company, the federal government would imprison her. If she destroyed her company to spite me, she would personally fund my children generational wealth. Her ultimate weapon, her willingness to destroy her own legacy, had been neutralized and turned into my winning lottery ticket. The realization broke her. The absolute and undeniable truth shattered the arrogant foundation of the matriarch of the Chicago Gold Coast. Her legs gave out. She collapsed against the marble wall, sliding slowly down to the cold floor. Her ruined white Chanel suit bunched up around her knees. Her pearl necklace, already broken from the courtroom scuffle, dug into the tile beneath her. She sat there on the ground, a hollow and pathetic shell of a woman who had just realized she had engineered her own absolute destruction. She did not scream. She did not threaten me anymore. She simply stared straight ahead with wide and empty eyes, hyperventilating as the panic attack fully consumed her. She looked up at me with her hands trembling violently in her lap. I looked down at her and felt absolutely no pity. I turned my back on Beatrice, leaving her sitting on the floor of the courthouse, completely broken and surrounded by the invisible ashes of her ruined legacy. Jackson placed a respectful hand on my shoulder and guided me toward the elevators. We walked away and stepped into the sunlight of a new and completely free life. 6 months later, the Chicago winter had thawed, but the chills surrounding the Gold Coast real estate empire remained absolute and permanent. The collapse was not a slow decline. It was a spectacular high-definition implosion broadcast across every financial news network in the country. The referral from Judge Hernandez had acted like blood in the water for the federal agencies. The Internal Revenue Service and the Securities and Exchange Commission did not just investigate. They executed a synchronized raid on the corporate headquarters. Dozens of federal agents and windbreakers carried out boxes of physical files and cloned every server in the building. Beatrice watched her entire legacy hauled away in cardboard boxes on live television. The forensic ledgers I had provided were flawless. They mapped the tax evasion, the offshore shell companies, and the embezzlement of charitable funds with such undeniable clarity that Beatrice's remaining lawyers advised her to seek a plea deal immediately. She refused. Her arrogance, the very trait that had caused her downfall, blinded her to the reality of her situation. She believed she could outsmart the federal government just as she believed she could outsmart me. She was wrong. The corporate structure buckled under the weight of the federal freeze and the ensuing panic from shareholders and investors. With no access to liquidity, the holding company defaulted on its massive commercial loans. They filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy, but the courts quickly converted it to a Chapter 7 liquidation. The prime real estate properties, the crown jewels of her portfolio, were auctioned off at a fraction of their value to satisfy creditors. Beatrice was formally indicted on multiple felony counts, including wire fraud, tax evasion, and federal extortion. The trial was swift. The audio recording from my smartwatch and Sydney's tearful testimony regarding the stolen charity funds sealed her fate. The judge handed down a sentence that stunned the Chicago elite. Beatrice was sentenced to 7 years in federal prison, with a mandatory minimum of 5 years before eligibility for parole. The wealth she had worshipped, the money she had used to control and manipulate her family, was entirely seized by the government to pay back taxes, penalties, and restitution to the pediatric cancer charity she had defrauded. The grand estate on the Gold Coast was foreclosed upon and sold. Beatrice traded her Chanel suits for a standard-issue federal uniform. She lost her empire, her freedom, and her identity. She had nothing left to leverage and no one left to control. Bradley experienced a spectacular fall from grace. Stripped of the protective shield of his mother wealth and the prestige of the family name, the true measure of his capabilities was exposed to the corporate world. It turned out that spending a decade as a titled executive in a company you did not build, making decisions you did not understand while relying on an accountant wife to fix your catastrophic errors, is not a transferable skill set. Bradley applied to dozens of high-level management positions across Chicago. He leveraged his country club contacts and called in favors from old friends. The response was universally cold. Nobody wanted to hire the disgraced heir of a toxic, federally indicted real estate empire. He was legally radioactive and practically useless. The polished resume that Beatrice had bought for him meant absolutely nothing in the real world. He eventually ran out of the small emergency fund he had managed to scrape together by selling his designer watches and whatever golf clubs the bank had not yet repossessed. Bradley, a man who once believed he was entitled to inherit billions, was forced to accept a mid-level retail management position at a suburban electronics store. He traded his custom Italian suits for a polyester polo shirt and a plastic name tag. He moved into a cramped fourth-floor walk-up studio apartment in a neighborhood he previously would not have dared to drive through. His days were spent arguing with disgruntled customers over return policies and managing teenage cashiers, a sharp and humiliating contrast to his former life of catered lunches and corner offices. Sydney had not stayed around long enough to witness the worst of his decline. The moment the federal freeze locked the accounts and the reality of the situation set in, her loyalty evaporated. She had signed up to be the pampered wife of a billionaire, not the struggling girlfriend of a retail manager facing massive legal debts. She packed her bags less than a week after the initial confrontation, abandoning Bradley without a second thought. She immediately pivoted, leveraging her youth and charm to secure a position as a personal assistant for a wealthy venture capitalist in Miami. She jumped ship to find a new target, leaving Bradley completely alone in the wreckage of the life he had destroyed for her. Bradley was a broken man. He had sacrificed his marriage, abandoned his newborn children, and watched his mother go to federal prison, all because he was too cowardly to stand up to the matriarch who controlled his allowance. Now he had nothing. He occasionally saw Leo and Lily during his court-mandated supervised visitations at the state facility. He would sit in a sterile room under the watchful eye of a social worker, awkwardly trying to interact with 2 growing toddlers who barely knew him. He was a cautionary tale of greed and weakness, a man who chose poorly and was paying the absolute devastating price for his cowardice. I thrived in the aftermath. The execution of the credit default swaps had resulted in a massive, perfectly legal payout from Wall Street. The millions I earned by shorting Beatrice's empire provided a foundation of absolute financial independence. The transaction cleared on a crisp Tuesday morning. I remember sitting at my kitchen island in the safe house, staring at the screen of my encrypted laptop, watching the 10-digit wire transfer populate into my secure accounts. It was not just money. It was impenetrable armor. It was the undeniable mathematical proof that I had outsmarted a billionaire dynasty and secured my children's future forever. I did not use the sudden influx of wealth to retreat into a life of idle leisure or quiet obscurity. That was not who I was. I used the capital to build my own empire. I established an elite boutique forensic accounting firm right in the heart of downtown Chicago. We specialized in untangling complex corporate fraud, tracking hidden assets in high net worth divorces, and auditing opaque offshore trusts. Clients flocked to my firm almost immediately. They recognized the sheer ruthless competence required to publicly dismantle a Gold Coast real estate dynasty. I built a team of brilliant, dedicated analysts and investigators deliberately creating a corporate culture rooted in integrity, transparency, and absolute precision. It was the exact opposite of the toxic, deceptive environment Beatrice had fostered for decades. My firm became a sanctuary for sharp minds who wanted to practice financial law and accounting the right way, holding corrupt billionaires accountable one ledger at a time. The work was demanding, but it fueled my spirit, reminding me every single day that truth and forensic diligence are the ultimate equalizers in a world obsessed with unearned power. It was a warm Saturday afternoon, exactly 3 years after I had fled the estate in the freezing Chicago night. The sun shone brightly over the expansive, meticulously landscaped backyard of my new home. I had purchased a beautiful, sprawling estate in the northern suburbs. It was a fortress of safety and warmth, surrounded by old-growth trees and secured by state-of-the-art biometric entry systems and 24-hour perimeter monitoring. Nobody from my past could ever step foot on this property without my explicit authorization. Yet despite the heavy security, the house was filled with light laughter and an overwhelming sense of peace. I stood on the flagstone patio, a glass of iced tea in my hand, watching Leo and Lily chase each other across the manicured lawn. They were 3 years old now, energetic, healthy, and completely insulated from the toxic legacy they had so narrowly escaped. They knew nothing of the extortion, the federal indictments, or the courtroom battles. To them, the world was a safe, vibrant place filled with people who loved them unconditionally. Jackson and Rachel were sitting at the patio table laughing loudly as Jackson attempted to assemble a complicated plastic water table for the twins. He was a brilliant defense attorney who could dismantle a hostile witness in 30 seconds, but he was currently losing a battle against snap-together plastic pipes. Rachel looked radiant in the afternoon sun. The stress and lingering pain of her family's vile rejection had been entirely erased by the peace of a life lived authentically and unapologetically. She had recently launched her own nonprofit organization funding legal defense for marginalized communities in Chicago, heavily supported by Jackson's connections and my firm's charitable arm. They were not just my in-laws anymore. They were my true family. They had stood by me when the Empire tried to crush me, risking their own safety and professional standing to protect mine and the twins. We had weathered the absolute worst of the storm together and forged a bond that blood alone could never guarantee. Jackson finally snapped the last plastic piece into place, cheering triumphantly as Leo and Lily ran over to inspect his work with squeals of delight. I smiled, taking another slow sip of my iced tea. The breeze carried the scent of blooming jasmine and barbecue smoke from the grill. I looked at the life I had built, the children I had protected, and the family I had consciously chosen. There were no fake smiles here. There were no manipulative strings attached to the food we ate or the roof over our heads. Everything we had was earned through resilience and unwavering loyalty. I had walked into the darkest, most terrifying moment of my life, facing a woman who believed her wealth gave her the right to buy my children, and I had turned that nightmare into an absolute structural victory. I had stripped her of her power, her freedom, and her illusion of control, leaving her with the cold reality of a federal prison cell. People in my social circles often say that you should never cross a mother protecting her children. It is a fundamental truth of nature. A mother will tear through steel and stone to ensure the safety of her offspring. But as I stood there watching my twins laugh in the sunshine, secure in the knowledge that their future was entirely protected by impenetrable, legally sound financial trusts, I realized there was a necessary addendum to that ancient rule. You should never cross a mother, and you should definitely, absolutely never cross a mother who knows exactly how to read your financial ledgers. I had taken their worst blow, absorbed the shock, and systematically dismantled their world, using their own arrogance against them. I had won completely. The story of Samantha powerfully illustrates how specialized knowledge and meticulous preparation can serve as the ultimate shield against emotional and financial manipulation. In many toxic family dynamics, power imbalances thrive because one party uses wealth status or intimidation as a weapon to control or diminish others. Samantha's journey teaches us that true empowerment comes from understanding your resources, knowing your worth, and refusing to be a victim of circumstance. One profound takeaway from this narrative is that knowledge is the most impenetrable armor. Beatrice relied entirely on arrogance, assuming her immense wealth could seamlessly buy compliance and erase a mother from her children's lives. However, Samantha's expertise as a forensic accountant allowed her to turn her oppressor's hubris into a devastating trap. This highlights a universal truth: when we equip ourselves with practical hard skills, whether that means mastering financial literacy, understanding our legal rights, or building professional independence, we actively protect our personal autonomy against those who seek to exploit us. Furthermore, the narrative beautifully redefines the concept of family. It demonstrates that loyalty, respect, and mutual care are the true currencies of familial bonds, rather than just shared bloodlines or elite last names. Samantha built a thriving, safe environment for her twins by intentionally choosing allies who stood by her during her absolute darkest moments. She proved that walking away from a toxic environment is never a defeat. It is the foundation of a true victory. As an AI processing these complex human dynamics, I observe that the courage to set firm, unapologetic boundaries is often the primary catalyst for profound personal growth. Take a moment today to evaluate your own financial knowledge and personal boundaries, and commit to learning one new skill that actively empowers your independence.